The confrontation in the shadows. The safe clicked open. The Vance sapphires glittered in the moonlight, looking like frozen tears. But as she reached for them, a light flickered in the hallway. "I thought I might find you here, Catherine," a voice said. It was Martha, the former maid who had survived the gossip industry and remained at Oakhaven. She wasn't carrying a weapon, she was carrying a candle. "Are you going to call the guards, Martha?" Catherine asked, her hand tightening around the jewels. Martha looked at the safe, then at the desperate, determined woman before her. "In this house, we all steal what we can, my lady. The men steal our lives. The church steals our souls. Why shouldn't you take the stones?" Martha didn't scream. She did something more scandalous. She helped. She gave Catherine the key to the back gate and a map of the patrol routes. This was the Forbidden Alliance, the solidarity of women who had been broken by the same system. Reclaiming the wealth, the fence and the forge. The jewelry thief had to operate in the demimonde, the world of the half-respectable. Catherine took the sapphires to an alchemist of a different sort, a gem cutter who didn't ask for names. "You want me to break these down, my lady?" the cutter asked, peering through his loupe. "It's a sin to destroy such history." "History is a burden," Catherine replied. "Turn them into gold. I want coins that don't have my father's face on them." By breaking the jewelry, she was destroying the paper trail of scandal. A necklace can be identified, but gold bars are anonymous. This was the final step of her liberation, the transformation of noble heritage into modern capital. The public reaction, the phantom's thief. When the theft was discovered, the vultures of the ton were horrified. They didn't suspect Catherine, they assumed it was a professional gang. The idea that a noblewoman could be a thief was more scandalous than the theft itself. "The sanctity of our homes is being violated," the Duke roared in the newspapers. He didn't realize that the sanctity had been violated long ago by his own cruelty. The jewelry thief became a phantom legend in the parlors. Other noblewomen, trapped in their own abusive marriages, looked at their necklaces and wondered, could I do it too? The independents realized. With the money from the sapphires, Catherine did not buy more lace. She bought a shipping firm in Liverpool. She used her knowledge of the elite to anticipate trade routes and luxury demands. She became a merchant queen in a world that only saw her as a fallen woman. She reclaimed her wealth, but more importantly, she reclaimed her agency. She no longer had to perform for an audience. She was the director of her own life. The cost of the reclamation. However, theft leaves a mark. Catherine lived the rest of her life under a pseudonym. She could never return to Oakhaven. She could never see her family again. The jewelry thief had bought her freedom, but she had paid with her past. For the American audience, this chapter is the ultimate outlaw story. It shows that when the law is used to oppress, the only way to find justice is to break the law. Catherine Vance was a criminal in the eyes of England, but she was a hero in the eyes of every woman who had ever been told she was property. Conclusion: the empty box. The chapter ends with a scene years later. The Duke of Vance is dying. He opens the family safe to pass the sapphires to the next generation. The box is empty. In its place is a small silk ribbon, the same kind used by the letters from the shadows. There is no note, there is no explanation, but the Duke knows. As he closes the empty box, he realizes that the wealth of the Vance family was never in the stones. It was in the women, and they had all finally left. The reclamation was complete, the independence was won, and the gilded cage was finally, truly bankrupt. Forbidden alliances, the secret society of rebels. In the dark underbelly of Victorian London, where the fog from the Thames swallowed the secrets of the rich and the screams of the poor, a new kind of rebellion was brewing. It was not a political uprising of men, but a forbidden alliance of women. This was a fictionalized underground network, a shadow sisterhood, where fallen noblewomen, cast out by their families for the sins of the heart, found a way to fight back. They didn't just survive, they built a bridge to freedom for every woman trapped behind a velvet curtain. This was the secret society of rebels. The birth of the sisterhood. It began in a small, nondescript basement in Soho. There were no crests on the door, no servants in livery. Inside sat three women who, according to the gossip industry, did not exist. There was Lady Catherine, the jewelry thief, Beatrice, the escapee from the convent's gate, and Juliana, the survivor of the alchemist's tonic. Individually, we are scandals, Catherine said, her voice echoing in the damp room. But together we are an infrastructure. If the men of Oakhaven can use the law to crush us, we will use the shadows to liberate others. The society was built on a simple, dangerous premise. No woman should be left behind in a gilded cage if she has the courage to break the lock. They called their network the Raven's Flight. The infrastructure of rebellion. The Forbidden Alliance operated like a ghost within the machinery of the state. They had their own paper trail, a system of coded messages hidden in the classified ads of the daily newspapers. Lost a sapphire ribbon near the docks, reward for the one who finds the light. To the Duke of Vance, it was nonsense. To a young girl being forced into an abusive marriage, it was a GPS coordinate. The society provided three things: the exit, the identity, and the ocean. They had a network of sympathetic laundresses who smuggled clothes, stable hands who borrowed carriages, and even a disgraced solicitor who specialized in forging death certificates. To the world, the woman died. In reality, the rebel was born. The Midnight Extraction. The society's most daring work was the Midnight Extraction. When a noblewoman was slated for exile to the countryside, the ravens would strike. Isabella Vance, now a veteran of the underground, led the mission to rescue a young countess from the clutches of her father's guards. They didn't use guns, they used the commoner's touch. They bribed the gatekeepers with the jewelry Catherine had reclaimed. They used the alchemist's tonic, not to erase a pregnancy, but to drug the wine of the guards. "Why are you doing this?" the terrified countess asked as she was hurried into a black carriage. "Because your father thinks he owns the sky," Isabella whispered. "We are here to show him that the birds have learned how to fly in the dark." The psychology of solidarity. For the American audience, this represents the socialist spirit within the aristocracy. The nobility was designed to keep women isolated, to make them believe they were the only ones suffering. The secret society broke that spell. When Juliana met a new initiate, she didn't ask about her title, she asked about her scars. "The nobility wants us to be rivals for a man's attention," Juliana told a group of rebels, "but we are sisters in their neglect. Their honor is a wall, our forbidden alliance is the tunnel underneath it." This solidarity was more scandalous than any affair. It was the most forbidden sin, women trusting each other more than they trusted the men who protected them. The financial engine, the wealth of the fallen. How did a group of fallen women fund an underground railroad? Through the jewelry thief network and the American heiress connection. Cora Miller, the Dollar Princess, was the silent financier of the Ravens. She channeled thousands of dollars into the society, hidden under the guise of charity for fallen women. "The Duke thinks I'm building a church," Cora laughed during a secret meeting. "In a way, I am, a church where the only commandment is, 'Thou shalt not be caught.'" This wealth allowed the society to buy safe houses in Liverpool, Paris, and New York. They created a transatlantic pipeline of freedom. A woman could disappear from a manor in Kent and reappear as a shop owner in Boston within 3 weeks. The betrayal, a spy in the shadows. Every alliance has a price. The gossip industry tried to infiltrate the Ravens. The Duke of Vance, suspicious of the vanishing ladies, hired a private investigator to find the leak in the nobility. The investigator found a maid who was part of the network. He threatened her with prison. "Tell me where they are," he demanded. "Tell me who the Raven is." The maid looked him in the eye, a look of commoner's defiance. "The Raven is every woman you've ever silenced. You can't arrest a shadow, sir." She took the alchemist's tonic herself that night, choosing the living death over the betrayal of her sisters. Her sacrifice became the legend that fueled the society's resolve. The legacy of the rebels. By 1895, the secret society of rebels had helped over 100 women escape. They were the ghosts of the empire. The nobility began to notice a pattern. Manors were becoming quieter. The gilded cages were empty. The men were left with their titles and their gold, but they were losing their property. The society proved that the choreographed performance required an audience and a cast. If the cast walked off the stage, the play was over. The Forbidden Alliance was the final blow to the structure of the old world. The final rendezvous. The chapter ends at the Liverpool docks. Catherine, Isabella, and Beatrice stand together, watching a ship depart for the new world. "We saved them, didn't we?" Beatrice asked, clutching her shattered rosary. "We didn't save them," Catherine replied. "We just gave them the key. They saved themselves." The Forbidden Alliance was not a charity, it was a revolution. As the fog rolled in, the three women vanished into the shadows of the city, ready to wait for the next secret correspondence, the next misplaced ribbon, the next woman who was ready to break the rules. Conclusion: the unwritten history. The history books do not mention the secret society of rebels. They mention the kings, the wars, and the treaties. But in the hidden floorboards of Oakhaven and the secret diaries of New York heiresses, the name of the Raven's flight lives on. It is a reminder that when noblewomen are pushed to the brink, they do not just fall, they find each other. The alliance was forbidden, the secrets were dangerous, but the freedom was absolute. The performance had become a resistance, and the resistance was winning. The cost of freedom, living in the aftermath. Freedom in the world of the 19th century elite was never free. It was a transaction, a trade where you offered your name, your title, and your past in exchange for the right to breathe. But once the gilded cage is left behind, once the public trial has stripped away the velvet and the lace, where does a woman go? She enters the demimonde, the world of the half-respectable. A place where former duchesses brush shoulders with actresses and disgraced lords gamble away their last shillings in smoke-filled basements. For the House of Vance, the aftermath was not a victory, it was a long, cold survival. The geography of the fallen. The demimonde was not a single place, it was a state of being. For Lady Isabella, now living under the name Issa Smith, in a small apartment in Montmartre, the geography was simple: avoid the places where the pure congregate. "We live in the cracks of the city," she wrote in her final diary. "We are the shadows that the nobility pretends not to see. We are the aftermath of their rules." The rooms here did not smell of lavender and beeswax. They smelled of cheap wine, coal dust, and the desperation of people who had nowhere else to go. The furniture was rented, the clothes were mended, and the internal silence was no longer a requirement, but a habit that wouldn't die. The psychological toll, the ghost of the title. The hardest part of the cost of freedom was the loss of the mirror. For 20 years, Isabella had looked in the mirror and seen a lady. Now she saw a woman who had to haggle with the grocer for a piece of mutton. "Your title is like a limb," an old, disgraced baron told her over a glass of absinthe. "You don't realize how much you use it until it's been amputated. You try to command a room, and no one listens. You try to buy respect, and your coins are the wrong color." The demimonde was filled with these amputees of the aristocracy. They sat in cafes, discussing the balls they used to attend and the men they used to know. It was a society built on nostalgia and bitterness. The freedom they had fought for felt, at times, like an empty room. The survival of the shrewd. But Isabella was a Vance. She realized that the aftermath required a new kind of choreographed performance. If she couldn't be a lady, she would be a woman of business. Using the last of the gold smuggled by the jewelry thief network, she opened a small translation office. She spoke 4 languages, the product of her noble education, and she realized that her stolen skills were the only things the demimonde couldn't take away. "They taught me French to flirt with counts," she told a fellow exile. "Now, I use it to negotiate shipping contracts. The nobility provided the weapons, I am just using them for my own war." The bitter taste of independence. Independence meant doing the things she had never been allowed to do. She walked the streets alone at night. She ate in public houses. She spoke to artists and revolutionaries. But there was a cost. The cost was the look in the eyes of her former friends when they saw her in the street. They didn't hiss. They didn't scream. They simply looked through her as if she were made of glass. To be fallen is to be invisible, she realized. They have erased me from the narrative. I am the deleted scene of the Vance dynasty. The shadowy figures of the New World. The aftermath also brought new allies. In the demimonde, she met the people she had once seen as furniture. The maids, the coachmen, and the stable hands, they were now her peers. Gabriel, her artist, was gone, but his memory remained as a catalyst. She realized that her rebellion had not been for a man, but for this, the right to be exhausted, the right to be poor, and the right to be herself. The nobility is a performance that never ends, she whispered. The demimonde is a reality that never sleeps. The final confrontation with the past. 10 years after her exile, Isabella received a letter. It was not from the Duke, but from Arthur, her brother. He was in Paris, dying of a broken spirit and a bankrupt estate. She went to see him in a derelict hotel, a place even lower than her own apartment. "You look happy, Isabella," he wheezed, looking at her simple dress and her work-stained hands. "I am not happy, Arthur," she replied, her voice steady. "I am simply real. You are dying for a name that no longer exists. I am living for a future that I have to build every morning." Arthur died that night. He was the last pure Vance. With him, the gilded cage finally collapsed into the dust of history. The legacy of the aftermath. The cost of freedom was high, but it bought something that no title could, an unedited life. Isabella never returned to Oakhaven. She never reclaimed her sapphires. She lived in the demimonde until the end of her days, a mentor to the young rebels who were just starting their own Raven's flight. She became the matriarch of the disowned. For the American audience, her story is the bridge between the old world and the new. It shows that the end of the nobility was not a tragedy, but a necessary clearing of the ground. Conclusion: the unmarked grave. Isabella died in 1912, just as the old world was preparing to tear itself apart in the Great War. She was buried in a small cemetery in Paris. There was no crest on her headstone. It simply read. The aftermath was complete. The House of Vance was a memory. The gossip industry had moved on to new victims. But in the quiet streets of Montmartre, the echo of her laughter remained, a reminder that while titles can be stolen and reputations can be executed, the cost of freedom is a price worth paying. The performance was over, the theater was dark, and for Isabella Vance, the lights of the city were finally enough. The final portrait: how history remembers the fallen. History is not a record of what happened, it is a record of who was left to tell the story. For the women of the House of Vance, those who took the alchemist's tonic, those who fled through the convent's gate, and those who chose the commoner's touch, history was, for a long time, a cruel judge. They were painted as villains, as fallen creatures who lacked the moral fiber to uphold a noble name. But today, as the dust settles on the ruins of the old world, we look at their portraits differently. We no longer see shame, we see resistance. This is the final portrait, a reflection on the journey from scandal to icon. The propagandist art. In the grand halls of Oakhaven, the portraits were designed to be the final word. Every brushstroke was a lie told in oil. The women were painted with downcast eyes, their hands folded neatly over prayer books, their skin a ghostly, unnatural white. "The artist doesn't paint the woman," Lady Elena, the dowager, once whispered. "He paints the expectation. If he captured the fire in our eyes, the Duke would burn the canvas." For a century, these paintings served as a choreographed performance of virtue. When Lady Isabella fled, her portrait was not destroyed, it was modified. The background was darkened, her expression was retouched to look melancholic and sinister. She was turned into a visual cautionary tale, a villain who had abandoned her duty for the shadows. The historian's bias. The gossip industry of the 19th century eventually became the historical record of the 20th. Early biographers looked at the letters from the shadows and labeled them as hysterical. They saw the jewelry thief not as a woman reclaiming her independence, but as a moral degenerate. They were written out of the lineage, says Dr. Sarah Jenkins, a modern historian. In the official family trees, you will see a name followed by the words died without issue or removed from record. But if you look at the police reports, the shipping manifests, and the secret diaries, you find the truth. They didn't die, they escaped. The final portrait of these women was composed of the things they left behind: a misplaced ribbon, a stained envelope, a wooden shard from a crate. These were the true heirlooms, but history ignored them because they didn't fit the noble narrative. From scandal to icon. The change began with the American heiress era and the rise of modern individualism. As the gilded cage of the Edwardian era collapsed, the world started to ask, why? Why did Catherine take the arsenic? Why did Elara choose the living death? For an American audience, these women are no longer seen as fallen. They are seen as pioneers. They were the first to realize that honor was a prison and bloodline was a myth. They were the original rebels who traded the safety of a title for the danger of a life. They weren't villains, a modern activist notes. They were the casualties of a war between the past and the future. Every time a Vance woman broke a rule, she was chipping away at the foundation of a system that oppressed half of humanity. The redemption of the demimonde. The life in the aftermath was once seen as a tragedy. History used to mourn the loss of status as if it were a death. But today, we celebrate the demimonde. We see the small translation office in Paris and the shipping firm in Liverpool as monuments to human resilience. Isabella Vance, once the scandal of the ton, is now the subject of feminist literature. She is remembered not for the masquerade, but for the secret society of rebels. She is the matriarch of the disowned, a title far more prestigious than any duchess could claim. The final portrait is no longer a static image on a wall. It is a living legacy of autonomy. The psychology of remembrance. Why do we care about these scandals today? Because they reflect our own struggles with expectation and identity. We see ourselves in the internal silence of Elara. We see our own desire for commoner's truth in the eyes of the rebels. The nobility thought they were protecting purity, but they were actually protecting stagnation. The fallen women were the only ones who were moving. They were the only ones who were alive. History has realized that the vultures of the ton were the true villains. The gossips, the cruel fathers, the abusive husbands, they are the ones we now view with contempt. The shame has shifted its weight. It no longer sits on the shoulders of the women, it sits on the grave of the men who tried to own them. The Vance blood today. The stolen inheritance and the American heiress ensured that the Vance blood did not stay in the damp halls of Oakhaven. It spread across the Atlantic. Today there are doctors in Boston, artists in New York, and teachers in California who carry the Vance DNA. They don't have titles, they don't have safes filled with sapphires, but they have the spirit of defiance. They have the raven's flight in their history. I found my great-great-grandmother's diary in an old trunk, says a woman in Seattle. It was signed Issa. She wrote about a masquerade and a man with leather mask. To the world, she was a scandal. To me, she is the reason I have the courage to speak my mind. The restoration of the portrait. In a modern museum, the final portrait of the House of Vance is finally being restored. They are removing the melancholic, retouching. They are cleaning away the soot of 100 years of silence. And underneath the grime, the fire is still there. The eyes of the women are bright. Their lips are curved in a secret smile. They look like they know a secret that the world is only now beginning to understand. That reputation is a temporary currency, but freedom is an eternal wealth. Conclusion: the unbroken line. The chapter ends with a return to the Manor of Oakhaven. It is now a heritage site, a place where tourists pay to see the gilded cage. They look at the portraits and hear the stories of the scandals. But the story is no longer told as a tragedy, it is told as a victory. The final portrait is not an ending, it is a continuation. The women who broke the rules created a new set of rules for the world to follow. They didn't just fall, they paved the way for every woman who came after them to stand tall. History remembers the fallen, but it remembers them as the ones who rose. The performance is over, the curtain is up, and the women of the House of Vance are finally, truly seen. Legacy of the unruly, the shattered glass ceiling. As the heavy curtains of the 19th century finally fell and the dawn of the modern world broke over the horizon, the ruins of the nobility were not just made of stone and mortar, they were made of broken expectations. The saga of the House of Vance, from the gilded cage to the public trial, was not merely a collection of scandals, it was a demolition. This final chapter looks at the legacy of the unruly, how the women who dared to break the rules paved the way for modern female autonomy, and how their defiance shattered the glass ceiling of a rigid, noble era. The death of the old guard. By the end of the First World War, the world that the Duke of Vance had died trying to protect was gone. The grand estates were being sold to pay for inheritance taxes, and the titles were becoming ornaments rather than instruments of power. The nobility didn't just lose their money, writes modern sociologist Dr. Elena Rossi, they lost their monopoly on honor. And they lost it because the women of the family refused to be its silent guardians. The legacy of the unruly began when the first Vance woman chose her heart over her house. Every scandal, the jewelry thief, the American heiress, the secret society, had been a crack in the foundation. By 1920, the glass ceiling was not just cracked, it was lying in shards on the floor of the Great Hall. The political shift. The scandals of the 1880s were the seeds of the suffrage movements of the 1900s. The public trial of Ilara Vance had shown the world the grotesque inequality of the divorce laws. The exile to the countryside had highlighted the lack of property rights for women. We owe our votes to the women who were called scandalous before we were called citizens, a suffragette wrote in a letter to the London Times in 1918. The noble women who broke the rules provided the legal and social case studies for reform. Their suffering was the fuel for the fire of justice. They proved that the noble era was built on the suppression of half the population, and once that suppression was challenged, the entire system became unsustainable. The new woman. The American heiress, Cora Miller, had brought more than gold to Oakhaven. She had brought the spirit of the new world. This spirit, the idea that a woman's value is inherent, not inherited, became the new standard. The legacy of the unruly is found in the internal silence being replaced by the public voice. Modern female autonomy is the direct descendant of the forbidden alliances of the past. Today, a woman in a boardroom is using the same grit that Lady Catherine used to reclaim her sapphires. She is using her knowledge of the elite to navigate power, but this time, she is doing it in the light. A global echo. The impact was not limited to England. The transatlantic alliance created a global conversation about the cost of freedom. In America, the daughters of the dollar princesses became the philanthropists, the politicians, and the professionals of the 20th century. They didn't hide their ancestors' scandals, they wore them as badges of resilience. My grandmother was a rebel, became a point of pride. The legacy of the unruly transformed the stain on the name into a strength of the spirit. The glass ceiling was shattered, and the shards became the diamonds in a new kind of crown, a crown of self-ownership. The end of the performance. The most significant legacy of these noble scandals was the end of the choreographed performance. We no longer live in a world where a misplaced ribbon or a stained envelope can destroy a life. We are allowed to be messy, says a modern Vance descendant, an architect in Chicago. We are allowed to have a commoner's touch. We are allowed to fail and still be respected. That is the true inheritance my ancestors fought for. The gilded cage is now a museum, and the alchemist's tonic has been replaced by modern medicine. But the shadowy figures, who profited from shame have been replaced by a world that slowly, but surely, is learning to value the truth. The final reflection, the mirror of history. When we look back at the House of Vance, we don't see a tragedy anymore, we see a liberation. The living death of the exile was the birth of the individual. The stolen inheritance was the victory of the authentic. History has finally restored the final portrait. The women are no longer villains, they are the architects of our freedom. They were the ones who had the courage to be unruly in a world that demanded they be proper. They broke the rules so that we could make our own. Conclusion: the open sky. The saga ends not in the damp halls of Oakhaven, but in the open air. The final image of our story is not a portrait on a wall, but a woman standing on the deck of a ship, looking toward a horizon that she chose for herself. The legacy of the unruly is the knowledge that the glass ceiling can never be rebuilt. Once it is shattered, the sky is the only limit. The performance is over, the curtain is shredded, the gossip industry is a relic of the past, and the women of the House of Vance, they are finally, truly home. The story of the noble scandals is a story of human triumph. It is a reminder that no cage is strong enough, no rule is rigid enough, and no silence is loud enough to stop the soul from finding its way to the light. The legacy is ours, the freedom is theirs. The dowager's revenge, matriarchs holding the strings. In the cold, calculating world of the Victorian aristocracy, power did not always wear a crown or hold a scepter. Often, it wore a widow's weeds and sat in a high-backed armchair by a dying fire. While the men fought duels and debated in Parliament, the true architecture of the nobility was maintained by the matriarchs, the dowagers who had survived the scandals of their youth to become the keepers of the family's darkest secrets. For the House of Vance, the strings were held by the Dowager Duchess, Elena. A woman whose revenge was a dish served cold, garnished with the silence of 40 years. The invisible throne. Elena Vance did not move with the grace of the young, she moved with the gravity of an empire. She was 70 years old, her skin like crumpled parchment, but her eyes were as sharp as the diamonds she wore around her neck. She lived in the east wing of Oakhaven, a territory that even the Duke, her son, entered with a sense of trepidation. The men think they laid, she would whisper to her reflection, but they are merely the heralds. It is the women who decide which bloodline continues, and which one is allowed to wither on the vine. The dowager's revenge was not a single act of violence, it was a lifetime of strategic manipulation. Elena had seen 3 generations of rebels. She had seen daughters-in-law cry and granddaughters flee, and in every case, she had been the one to decide their fate. The secret history of a rebel. To understand Elena's power, one had to understand her past. In 1834, she had been the scandal of London. She had loved a French revolutionary, a man with fire in his eyes and no title to his name. She had been caught, shamed, and nearly exiled. But Elena did not break, she negotiated. She had married the old Duke of Vance, a man she loathed, to save her family from ruin. But in exchange, she had systematically gathered evidence of the Duke's own infidelities, his debts, and his crimes. By the time he died, she didn't just inherit his money, she inherited the strings of the dynasty. "I broke the rules to learn how to enforce them," she told Lady Isabella, who had been brought before her for judgment. "I am not your enemy, child, I am your future, if you are clever enough to survive." The Shadow Alliance. The American audience might expect the matriarch to be the villain, but the dowager's power was more complex. When Isabella was caught in her commoner's touch scandal, the Duke wanted to send her to Blackwood for a living death. Elena intervened, not out of love, but out of a cold, pragmatic sisterhood. "You will not lock her away, Arthur," Elena said to the Duke, her voice like a velvet-covered brick. "If you do, I will release the letters your father wrote to that actress in Paris, the ones that prove your pure lineage is built on a foundation of lies." The Duke froze. This was the dowager's revenge in action. She protected the younger rebels, not because she approved of their sins, but because she used their rebellion as a leverage against the men who dared to control her. The price of order. However, Elena was not always a savior. If a young woman's rebellion was sloppy, if it threatened the actual survival of the house without offering any strategic advantage, Elena was the first to crush her. She had seen a young cousin, Mary, fall for a soldier who had nothing to offer but his heart. Mary was weak. She cried in the parlors and begged for mercy. "Weakness is the only sin I do not forgive," Elena said, as she signed the papers to have Mary sent to a remote convent in Ireland. "If you want to break the rules, you must be strong enough to write new ones. If you are just a leaf in the wind, you deserve to be stepped on." This was the terrifying duality of the matriarch. She was a mentor to the strong and a predator to the weak. She held the strings, and if the puppet didn't dance to her rhythm, she cut the cord. The gossip industry's master. Elena was the silent CEO of the gossip industry. While the servants sold secrets for shillings, Elena traded them for estates. She knew who was taking the alchemist's tonic. She knew which lord was losing his inheritance at the gambling tables. She sat in her parlor, receiving guests like a spider in a web. Every tea party was an intelligence briefing. Every friend who came to visit was a source of data. "A secret is like a fine wine, Beatrice," she told Isabella's friend. "It must be kept in the dark until the moment it reaches its peak value. You, my dear, poured yours out too early. That is why Isabella is free, and you are still trapped in that miserable marriage I arranged for you." The Dowager's legacy. As the saga of the Vance family reached its climax, Elena made her final move. She knew her time was coming to an end. She looked at Isabella, the rebel she had protected, and at Arthur, the son she had controlled. "The era of the Duke is over," she whispered to herself. She began to transfer her personal wealth, gold that the Duke didn't even know existed, into a trust for Isabella in America. She used her strings to ensure that the stolen inheritance of Julian was recognized by the courts. Why? Because she wanted to burn the system that had almost burned her in 1834. Her revenge was the destruction of the very patriarchy she had served for 40 years. The psychology of the matriarch. Elena Vance represents the hidden power of historical women. For the American audience, she is the symbol of resilience. She shows that while women were legally owned by men, the intellectual and social control often belonged to the one who stayed in the room the longest. The Dowager's revenge was her way of saying that she had never forgotten the French Revolutionary. She had never forgiven the Duke, and she would ensure that the next generation of women wouldn't have to wait 70 years to be free. The empty chair. The chapter ends with Elena sitting in her armchair, her eyes closed, a faint smile on her lips. A letter arrived from America, a simple drawing of a raven, the symbol Isabella used in her secret letters. The strings were finally still. In the great hall, the men were arguing about the budget and the titles. They didn't realize that the foundation of the house had already been moved. They didn't realize that the Dowager had already won. Elena Vance died that night, but the rebels she protected were already halfway across the ocean. The strings were cut, but the puppets had already learned how to walk on their own. The Dowager's revenge was complete. The convent's gate forced piety as punishment. In the shadowed history of the European nobility, the church was not always a sanctuary for the weary soul. Often, it was a fortress for the unwanted woman. When a daughter of a noble house refused to marry for land, when she fell in love with a commoner or demanded a life of her own, she was not always sent to the moors. Sometimes, she was taken to the convent's gate. This was the sacred exile, a prison of cold stone and enforced silence, where piety was used as a punishment, and the bride of Christ was often a girl who had been dragged to the altar in chains of social duty. The verdict of the cloister. For Lady Beatrice Vance, the cousin of Ilara, the verdict was delivered in a whisper behind a mahogany desk. Beatrice had done the unthinkable. She had publicly rejected the proposal of a wealthy, agging baron to whom her father owed a gambling debt. "If you will not be a wife," her father had roared, his face mottled with rage, "then you shall be a saint, but you will not remain in my house to shamming me with your disobedience." The convent's gate was a convenient solution for the nobility. It removed the rebellious woman from the marriage market without the messiness of a public execution. It turned a family scandal into an act of religious devotion. To the world, Beatrice was dedicating her life to God. To the Vance family, she was being buried alive where her voice could no longer reach the parlors of London. The anatomy of the gate. The Abbey of St. Jude stood on a jagged cliff, overlooking a sea that looked like hammered lead. The air here was salt-soaked and heavy with the scent of incense and damp wool. As the iron gates groaned shut behind her, Beatrice felt a chill that no prayer could warm. The Mother Superior, a woman whose heart had been hardened by decades of managing the nobility's mistakes, did not offer a blessing. She offered a haircut. "Here you have no name," the Mother Superior whispered, the shears glinting in the candlelight. "You are not Lady Beatrice. You are Sister Silence. Your gold, your silk, and your pride, they stay outside the gate. Here the only currency is obedience." The ritual of forced piety was a systematic stripping of the self. Her long, chestnut hair, the pride of her youth, fell to the cold stone floor. She was dressed in a habit of rough, grey wool that chafed her skin like a physical reminder of her fall from grace. The psychology of enforced silence. The living death of the countryside was a prison of space. The convent was a prison of time. Every hour was regulated by the tolling of a bell. Matins, lords, prime. The women here were mostly from the nobility, younger daughters who were excess to requirements, or wives who had seen too much of their husband's dark side. They were a secret society of the forgotten. They were forbidden to speak during the day, and their nights were spent in cells that were little more than stone boxes. "Prayer is not your comfort," the Mother Superior told them during a sermon. "Prayer is your penance. You are here to wash away the shame of your bloodline with your tears." Beatrice realized that the church had become the ultimate weapon of the patriarchy. By cloaking their cruelty in the language of holy grace, the men of the Vance family had made their betrayal look like a blessing. The shadow of the alchemist in the abbey. Even inside the holy walls, the secrets of the bedchamber followed them. Beatrice discovered that the abbey served another, darker purpose. It was a recovery ward for the inconvenient results of noble scandals. In the infirmary, she saw girls with haunted eyes, girls who had taken the alchemist's tonic and were now being hidden away until their health returned. The church profited from this silence. The noble families paid enormous donations to ensure that the abbey kept its secrets. "The alchemist provides the tonic," Beatrice wrote in a secret diary she hid in the lining of her prayer book. "But the church provides the shroud. We are the ghosts that the world refuses to mourn." The performance of the saint. Beatrice, being a Vance, did not break. She learned to use the internal silence she had mastered at Oakhaven. She played the part of the perfect nun. She bowed her head lower than the others. She fasted until her ribs showed. But behind the mask of piety, her mind was a furnace of rebellion. She spent her nights memorizing the geography of the abbey, the shift of the guards, the timing of the tides at the base of the cliff. "They think the gate is the end," she whispered to the shadows, "but a gate is just a door that hasn't been opened yet." The visit of the matriarch. 6 months into her sentence, a carriage arrived. It was the Dowager Duchess, Elena. She did not come to rescue Beatrice, she came to assess her. They met in the parlor of the abbey, separated by an iron grate, the physical manifestation of the divide between the pure and the fallen. "Are you broken yet, Beatrice?" the Dowager asked, her eyes searching for a crack in the girl's grey habit. "I am not broken, grandmother," Beatrice replied, her voice steady and hollow. "I am simply waiting. You taught me that strings can be pulled from the shadows. I am just learning a new set of strings." The Dowager smiled, a cold, terrifying expression. "Good. The Vance blood should not be diluted by weak religion. I have a task for you. There is a letter that must be smuggled out, a letter that concerns the stolen inheritance of Julian. If you do this, I will ensure the gate opens. The sacred escape. Beatrice became the messenger of the abbey. Using the network of fallen women inside the walls, she smuggled information that helped dismantle the Duke's power in London. She turned the forced piety into a fortress of intellect. The church thought they were tamming her. In reality, they were providing her with the silence she needed to plot the downfall of the men who put her there. The escape, when it came, was not a violent breakout. It was a legal maneuver funded by the Dowager. A papal annulment was bought, not with faith, but with the Vance gold that the Duke thought was lost. As Beatrice stepped through the convent's gate, for the last time, she didn't look back at the abbey. She looked at her hands. They were rough, stained with the ink of secret letters and the salt of the sea. She was no longer a lady. She was no longer a saint. She was a woman who had survived the sacred prison and come out with a heart of steel. Conclusion: the shattered rosary. The chapter ends with Beatrice standing on the cliffside, throwing her wooden rosary into the crashing waves below. The church had tried to use the cross to crush her spirit, but she had used the cross as a ladder to climb out of her cage. The forced piety had failed. In the great hall of Oakhaven, the Duke received news of her release. He realized that the one place he thought was secure, the sanctity of the church, had been infiltrated by the very women he tried to silence. The gate was open, the silence was broken, and the brides of Christ were beginning to realize that the world outside was waiting for them, and it was a world that no longer cared about pure lineages or holy punishments. The performance was over. The rebellion was just beginning. Diamond dust and arsenic, the dark side of defiance. In the opulent dining halls of the Victorian nobility, death did not always arrive with the thunder of a duel or the dramatic flair of a public execution. Sometimes, it arrived in a crystal goblet of fine sherry or a silver spoon of lavender-scented porridge, when the gilded cage became a torture chamber, when the choreographed performance was punctuated by the bruises of an abusive husband. Some noblewomen turned to the most silent of all rebellions. This was the dark side of defiance, a world of diamond dust, arsenic, and the lethal chemistry of desperation. The anatomy of an unbearable marriage. For Lady Catherine Vance, the marriage to Lord Blackwood was not a union, it was an occupation. Behind the closed doors of their manor, the noble name was a mask for a man who used his cane for more than walking. "You are my property, Catherine," Blackwood would whisper, his breath smelling of stale gin and cold cruelty. "Legally, I own your lands, your jewelry, and your breath. There is no divorce for people like us, only the grave." In the 1880s, the law was a wall that kept women trapped. A woman could not leave an abusive husband without losing her children, her home, and her very identity. For Catherine, the scandal of a divorce was impossible, but the silence of a widowhood, that was an opportunity. The alchemist's darker trade. Catherine did not go to the apothecary. She went to the back streets, to the same shadowy figures who provided the alchemist's tonic. But this time, she didn't want to erase a mistake. She wanted to erase a monster. The alchemist sat in a room that smelled of sulfur and wet dog. He didn't look at her face. He only looked at the diamond ring she placed on the table. "Arsenic is common," he whispered, his voice a dry rasp. "It leaves a trail in the hair, but diamond dust, that is an artist's tool. It doesn't poison the blood, it shreds the stomach from the inside, slowly, invisibly. It looks like a gastric fever. The doctors will call it an act of God." The lethal chemistry of the tea tray. The dark side of defiance required a nerves of steel. For months, Catherine played the part of the submissive wife. She bowed her head, she endured his rages, and every night she prepared his restorative tea. The process was rhythmic, a pinch of the white powder, the inheritance powder, as it was known in France, a stir of the silver spoon, a smile as she handed him the cup. "To your health, my lord," she would say, her voice as steady as a surgeon's hand. The psychology of the poisoner is one of patient justice. Every time he struck her, she added a grain more. It was a slow-motion execution, a private trial where she was the judge, the jury, and the executioner. She wasn't just killing a man, she was dismantling a system that told her she had no right to exist. The performance of the grieving widow. Lord Blackwood's decline was a medical mystery for the local physicians. He grew thin, his hair fell out in clumps, he suffered from spasms of the gut that left him screaming in the night. Catherine was always by his side. She held his hand. She wiped his brow with cool silk. She played the devoted wife with such perfection that the vultures of the Tun wept for her strength. "She is a saint," Lady Danbury whispered at the funeral preparations. "To care for him so tenderly while he wasted away. The Vance women are truly of superior stock." This was the ultimate scandal, a murder committed in plain sight, masked by the very etiquette that was designed to oppress her. The gossip industry was her greatest shield. No one would believe that a woman so pure could be so deadly. The historical precedent, the Aqua Tofana legacy. Catherine was not an isolated case. History is littered with the ghosts of noblemen who died suddenly after mistreating their wives. In Italy, it was Aqua Tofana. In London, it was the Victorian widow's tea. These women used poison because they had no physical power. A duel was for men, arsenic was for the silenced. It was the only weapon that bypassed the physical strength of the husband and the legal strength of the state. "We are the Borgias of the back streets," Catherine wrote in a diary that she later burned. "We do not fight with swords, we fight with the things they trust the most, their food, their drink, and our smiles." The stained spoon. The danger of the paper trail extended to the kitchen. One evening, a young scullery maid found a silver spoon with a strange, metallic residue. She brought it to the housekeeper. "It smells of bitter almonds, Mrs. Crane," the girl said, her eyes wide with curiosity. Catherine, standing in the shadows of the hallway, felt her heart freeze. If the maid spoke, the gilded cage would be replaced by the gallows. She didn't panic. She used the strings of the matriarch. She walked into the kitchen, took the spoon, and dropped it into the fire. "It is a chemical for cleaning the silver, child," she said, her voice dripping with cold authority. "Go back to your work, or you will find yourself in the street without a reference." The maid stayed silent, not because she believed the lie, but because she understood the power. In the nobility, the truth was a luxury only the victors could afford. The monster's end. On a rainy Tuesday in November, Lord Blackwood breathed his last. His final look was not one of love, but of a sudden, terrifying realization. He looked at the cup in Catherine's hand. He looked at the lack of tears in her eyes. "You," he gasped, the word rattling in his throat. "Me," she whispered, leaning close so only he could hear. "The property has reclaimed itself, Arthur. Sleep well." The death certificate read, "Complications of the liver." The funeral was a grand affair. The Duke of Vance stood at the grave, proud of his daughter's fortitude. The ghost at the table. Catherine was free. She inherited the Blackwood fortune. She was no longer a property, she was a power. But the dark side of defiance left a permanent stain on her soul. She could never drink tea again without checking the bottom of the cup. She saw the alchemist's face in every shadow. The murder was the first transgression that could never be washed clean by time or piety. For the American audience, this chapter serves as a reminder that the noble era was not just about lace and romance. It was a time of extreme violence, where the only way to escape a living hell was to create one for someone else. Conclusion: the silent victory. The chapter ends with Catherine standing in the gallery of Oakhaven. She looks at the portraits of the men, the warriors, the dukes, the duelists. "You fought for honor," she whispered to the painted faces. "I fought for breath. Your names are in the books. My name is in the silence." She walked away, her black silk dress rustling like a warning. The scandal of the diamond dust remained a secret, buried in the churchyard under a heavy marble monument. The House of Vance was secure. The widow was wealthy. The monster was gone. But in the dark corners of the bedchamber, the smell of bitter almonds lingered, a reminder that when women are pushed to the brink, the most beautiful flowers can be the most poisonous. The defiance was complete. The cost was her soul. The American heiress, new money, old scandals. In the waning years of the 19th century, a new storm crossed the Atlantic, but it didn't bring rain or wind. It brought gold, and the daughters of the Gilded Age. These were the dollar princesses, the heiresses of American railroad kings and steel magnates, arriving in Europe with trunks full of worth gowns and a spirit that refused to be bowed by 1,000 years of etiquette. For the House of Vance, the arrival of Cora Miller from New York was more than a marriage of convenience. It was a cultural explosion that shook the very foundations of the aristocracy. The arrival of the invaders. The British nobility was land-rich but cash-poor. Their estates were crumbling, their roofs were leaking, and their debts were mounting. Across the ocean, the Americans were cash-rich but status-poor. They had millions, but they had no crests. The deal was simple: American gold for a British title. When Cora Miller's carriage pulled up to Oakhaven, she didn't wait for the footman to open the door. She stepped out herself, her movements fast, loud, and unapologetic. "Is this the Grand Manor?" she asked, looking up at the ancient stones. "It looks like it could use a good scrubbing and about $10,000 worth of electricity." The Duke of Vance, standing on the steps, felt a twitch in his jaw. To him, Cora was an invader, a woman with new money who didn't understand the internal silence required of a duchess. Breaking the rules of the parlor. Cora didn't just break the rules, she ignored them because she didn't believe in them. In the parlor, where women were expected to speak of flowers and embroidery, Cora spoke of the stock market and the price of coal. "Why do you all whisper?" she asked during a stiff tea party. "Is there a ghost in the room, or is it just that you have nothing interesting to say?" Lady Danbury's fan snapped shut. "We speak with decorum, Miss Miller, something you might find in a dictionary, even if you can't find it in New York." "Decorum is just a fancy word for boredom," Cora shot back, her laughter ringing through the room like a hammer on an anvil. The gossip industry went into overdrive. To the British, she was vulgar. To the servants, she was a breath of fresh air. Cora tipped the maids with gold coins and asked them about their families, a commoner's touch that horrified the Duke but won the hearts of the staff. The scandal of the waltz. The ultimate transgression happened at the Queen's ball. The choreographed performance of the nobility required a slow, dignified movement, but Cora wanted to dance. She approached the Earl of Sutherland, the man intended for the exiled Isabella, and demanded a waltz that was far too fast for the orchestra's comfort. "In America, we move when we're happy," she told the Earl as she spun him around the room. The scandal wasn't just in the speed, it was in the eye contact. Cora looked the men in the eye. She didn't look at their feet or their waistcoats. She looked at them as equals, a forbidden sin in a world where women were supposed to be property. The Dollar Princess's revenge, the renovations. Cora's real power was her purse. She realized that the Vance family hated her money, but they couldn't live without it. She began a systematic renovation of Oakhaven that was actually a deconstruction of their pride. She tore down the heavy velvet curtains that had blocked the sun for decades. She installed modern plumbing that hissed through the ancient walls. She replaced the portraits of glory and blood with modern art from Paris. "You are erasing our history, Cora," the Duke roared as he saw his great-grandfather's hunting trophies being moved to the cellar. "No, Arthur," she replied, not looking up from her ledger. "I am making it habitable. Your history is dusty, your future is expensive. I'm just paying the bill for your survival." The psychology of the New World. For the American audience, Cora represents the new spirit. She didn't care about the alchemist's tonic or the secrets of the bedchamber. If she was unhappy, she said so. If she was bored, she left the room. The gilded cage couldn't hold her because she owned the cage. "You can't exile me to the countryside," she told the Dowager Duchess, Elena. "I've already bought the neighboring estate. If you lock me out of Oakhaven, I'll just build a bigger house next door and hire away all your servants." The dowager, for the first time in her life, met a woman she couldn't control with a whisper. Cora Miller was a global scandal, a woman who used her new money to purchase a freedom that the old money women couldn't even imagine. The alliance of the rebels. Cora eventually found the paper trail of Lady Isabella. Instead of using the scandal to destroy Isabella, Cora used her money to track her down in America. She sent a letter to the exile with a check for $50,000. "Don't come back to England," the note read. "It's a graveyard with better wallpaper. Stay in the New World. It's louder, but you can breathe here. See." This was the ultimate betrayal of the nobility, a transatlantic alliance of women. The Dollar Princess and the exiled rebel were now working together to ensure that the bloodline was no longer a prison. The shaking foundations. By the time the century turned to 1900, the British aristocracy was no longer the same. The dollar princesses had brought more than just money. They had brought the concept of individualism. They had shown that a woman could be a duchess and a businesswoman. They had shown that common blood was just as red as noble blood and usually much healthier. The Duke of Vance died in a house that was warm, lit by electricity, and filled with the sound of his American wife's laughter. He died wealthy, but he died knowing that his world was gone. The invaders had won. Conclusion: the new aristocracy. The chapter ends with Cora Miller, now the Dowager Duchess of Vance, sitting in the Great Hall. She is older now, but her eyes are still bright. She is reading a newspaper from New York. The paper trail of scandal is now a paper trail of progress. The old rules are in the fireplace, burning alongside the coal she bought with her father's money. The American heiress hadn't just joined the nobility, she had dismantled it and rebuilt it in her own image. The gilded cage was now a modern home. As the sun set over Oakhaven, Cora raised a glass of American bourbon to the portraits on the wall. "The secrets are out, boys," she whispered, "and the bills are all paid." A public trial, the spectacle of the divorce court. In the late Victorian era, there was no place more terrifying for a noblewoman than the London divorce court. It was a theatre of shame, a room designed not for justice, but for the systematic dismantling of a person's dignity. When a noble scandal reached the newspapers, it ceased to be a private tragedy. It became a public spectacle, a form of moral entertainment for the masses who stood in line for hours just to hear the dirty laundry of a duchess. For the House of Vance, this was the final execution. The day the internal silence was replaced by the roar of the tabloid press. The opening of the gates. The year was 1892. The case, Vance versus Vance. Outside the courthouse, the crowd was thick with commoners, laborers, shopkeepers, and street urchins, all clutching copies of the Illustrated Police News. They wanted to see a lady bleed. Inside, the air was stagnant, smelling of old wood, floor wax, and the cold sweat of the accused. "In this court," the judge began, his voice like the snapping of dry twigs, "the law does not care for your titles. It only cares for your sins. Lady Ilara, you stand accused of criminal conversation and desertion of your noble duties. How do you plead?" Ilara stood in the witness box. She wore a dress of plain black wool, no jewelry, no lace, no gilded cage finery. She looked not at the judge, but at the gallery of reporters whose pens were poised like daggers. The anatomy of a public execution. A divorce trial for the nobility was a biological autopsy of a marriage. Every secret was dragged into the light. The letters from the shadows were read aloud, their metaphors of love dissected by lawyers with cold, mocking voices. "Is it true, my lady," the prosecutor asked, stepping so close she could smell the peppermint on his breath, "that you met this stable hand in the dead of night, that you allowed him to touch skin that belongs legally to your husband?" The crowd in the gallery gasped. A woman in the back fainted, or pretended to. This was the moral entertainment the masses craved. It allowed the poor to feel superior to the rich, and the pure to feel superior to the fallen. "I did not belong to my husband," Ilara said, her voice clear and resonant. "I am not a piece of land to be owned. I am a woman who chose to be free. The weaponization of the tabloids. While the trial happened in the courtroom, the war was won in the streets. The gossip industry had evolved. It was no longer just whispers in the parlor, it was the yellow press. Headlines screamed across London, "The Duchess in the dirt," and "The stable hand's secret." Reporters followed the Vance family to their carriages, shouting questions about the alchemist's tonic and the stolen inheritance. The velvet curtain had been torn down, and in its place was a glass wall where the entire world could watch the dynasty crumble. "They aren't just reporting a case," the Duke whispered to his lawyer. "They are eating us alive. We are the feast for the hungry." The performance of the witness. The most humiliating moment was the cross-examination of the maid. Martha, who had been fired from Oakhaven, was brought to the stand. She was the shadowy figure who now held the power of life and death over her former mistress. "Did you see them, Martha?" the lawyer asked. "In the orchard, in the hay." Martha looked at Ilara. There was a moment of silence, a heartbeat where the history of the gilded cage hung in the balance. "I saw a lady who was lonely," Martha said, her voice trembling. "And I saw a man who saw her as a person. If that is a crime, then every woman in this room is a criminal." The judge hammered his gavel. "Order, this is a court of law, not a penny dreadful novel." The psychology of the masses. Why did the public love the spectacle? For the American audience, this is the birth of the celebrity scandal. The fall of the Vance family was a distraction from the poverty and misery of the industrial city. The moral aspect was the excuse. People claimed they were watching the trial to ensure the sanctity of marriage was upheld. In reality, they were there for the thrill of seeing a goddess fall into the mud. "They don't want me to be innocent," Ilara realized as she looked at the faces in the gallery. "They want me to be a monster so they can feel like saints." The verdict and the cost. The trial lasted 3 weeks. In the end, the divorce was granted, but the cost was absolute. Ilara was stripped of her title, her fortune, and her right to see her younger sisters. She was legally dead in the eyes of society. But as she walked out of the courthouse, the crowd did something unexpected. They didn't hiss, they didn't throw stones, they were silent. They saw a woman who had stood in the center of a hurricane and refused to be blown away. They saw that the gilded cage had been broken, and though the bird was battered, she was finally out. The aftermath, the ghost of the courtroom. The Vance name was forever stained. The public trial had done what the duels of honor and the exile could not. It had made the nobility look pathetic. The mystery was gone. The choreographed performance was revealed to be a farce. The Duke returned to Oakhaven, but he never opened the gates again. He lived in a house filled with the ghosts of the trial, haunted by the words printed in the newspapers. "We are no longer the leaders of the people," he told his son Arthur. "We are their entertainment, and once the audience stops being afraid, the play is over." Conclusion: the shattered mirror. The chapter ends with Ilara boarding a train. She has nothing but a small suitcase and her own name. She looks at a discarded newspaper on the seat next to her. There is her face, sketched in ink. She takes a pen from her bag and crosses out the word "fallen." Underneath, she writes "free." The spectacle of the divorce court was meant to be her execution. Instead, it was her liberation. The moral entertainment of the masses had accidentally provided the world with its first modern hero, a woman who refused to be a secret. The trial was over, the cage was gone, the performance had ended, and the truth was finally at large. The jewelry thief, reclaiming wealth through theft. In the rigid economy of the 19th century aristocracy, a woman without a man was a woman without a purse. When the public trial ended and the exile began, noblewomen were often cut off financially, stripped of their dowries, and left with nothing but the clothes on their backs. But some refused to starve in silence. They knew the layout of the manors, they knew the combination to the safes, and they knew the secret habits of the elite. They didn't become beggars. They became the most sophisticated thieves in Europe. For Lady Catherine Vance, theft was not a crime, it was a reclamation of her stolen independence. The poverty of the peerage. Catherine stood in a cold, rented room in East London. 6 months ago, she had been a duchess. Today, she was a ghost. Her bank accounts were frozen by her ex-husband's solicitors. Her father had disowned her to save the pure lineage. "They want me to crawl back and beg for a pittance," she whispered to the cracked mirror. "They want me to prove that a woman cannot survive without their noble mercy. They are mistaken." In the nobility, wealth was often tied up in jewels, diamonds, rubies, and emeralds that were family heirlooms. These jewels were legally the property of the men, but they were worn on the necks of the women. Catherine realized that if she could take back the Vance sapphires, she could buy a ticket to America and a new life. The anatomy of the heist. Catherine knew Oakhaven better than the Duke did. She knew which floorboards creaked in the West Wing. She knew that the night watchman always took his tea at 2:00 a.m. And she knew that the safe in the Duke's study was hidden behind a portrait of the third Duke, a man who had been a thief himself in the name of the crown. This was not a common burglary, it was a surgical strike. She dressed in the black silk of a mourning widow, a disguise that made her invisible in the shadows of the estate. As she slipped through the servants' entrance, she felt a strange sense of power. For years, she had been a prisoner in this house. Now she was its most dangerous guest. The psychology of the theft. "Why do you do it, Catherine?" she asked herself as she felt the cold steel of the safe. It wasn't just about the money, it was about the reclaiming of the self. Every jewel she pulled from the velvet-lined box represented a year of her life she had lost to the choreographed performance. The sapphire necklace, that was the year she spent in silence after her first miscarriage. The diamond tiara, that was the price of her forced marriage. By taking the jewels, she was taking back her time. She was converting the family's shame into her own freedom. The final correspondence. On the night before her wedding to the Earl, Isabella found a note on her pillow. It wasn't in an envelope. It wasn't tied with a ribbon. It was scratched into a piece of wood, a shard from a crate. "The trail may be burned, but the fire remains. Meet me at the altar or meet me in the river. I have the safe key. L." Isabella gasped. Lucien hadn't just survived, he had infiltrated the manor. The paper trail had led him straight into the heart of the beast. Paper or blood? Isabella looked at her wedding dress, a mountain of white lace that felt like a shroud. She had a choice. She could follow the script written by her ancestors, or she could follow the ink of her own heart. A misplaced ribbon had started the fire. A stained envelope had threatened the dynasty. But the final letter, the one written on a shard of wood, would be the one to burn it all down. Conclusion: the destruction of a dynasty. As the sun began to rise over Oakhaven, Isabella stood at her window. She saw the vultures arriving for the wedding. She saw her father in his finest regalia, confident that he had won. But she also saw the trail, not of paper, but of intent. The dangerous art of secret correspondence had taught her one thing: once you put your truth on paper, it cannot be unwritten. It can be hidden, it can be locked away, but it will always be there, waiting for a misplaced ribbon to reveal the truth. The dynasty of Vance was built on secrets, and today the secrets were coming for their payment. The commoner's touch, crossing class lines. In the rigid hierarchy of the late 19th century, a noblewoman's skin was expected to be as pale and untouched as fine porcelain. It was a skin that had never known the bite of the sun or the roughness of manual labor. But for Lady Isabella Vance, the commoner's touch was not a stain, it was an awakening. Falling for a man outside her class was not just a romantic choice. It was the most forbidden of all sins, a betrayal of her caste, her ancestors, and the very structure of the British Empire. The forbidden contact. The sin began in the stables of Oakhaven. It started with a horse, a wild, charcoal-grey stallion that refused to be broken by the Duke's veteran riders. Isabella had watched from the balcony as Gabriel, a wandering artist who had taken a job as a stable hand to survive the winter, approached the beast. He didn't use a whip. He didn't use chains. He used his voice, and a hand that moved with a terrifying, rhythmic grace. "The horse doesn't hate the rider," Isabella heard Gabriel whisper one afternoon. He hates the lie of the bit. He wants to know who is really holding the reins. Isabella felt a jolt of recognition. She too was a creature of the bit and the bridle. A week later, she found herself in the stables after midnight. The air was thick with the scent of hay, leather, and horse sweat, smells that were unseemly for a lady. Gabriel was there, sketching by the light of a single lantern. "You shouldn't be here, my lady," he said, without looking up. His voice had the rough texture of a man who worked with his hands. "The straw will ruin your silk, and the truth will ruin your life." The psychology of the class divide. Isabella stepped closer, her heart hammering. "My life is already ruined by the quiet, Gabriel. I want to know what it's like to touch something that hasn't been polished by a servant first." Gabriel stood up. He was taller than the noblemen she knew, and he didn't bow. He looked at her with an equality that was more scandalous than any kiss. "My hands are stained with charcoal and earth," he said, holding them out. "They are not pure like yours. If I touch you, Isabella, the mark will never come off. You will never be able to go back to your tea parties and your earl." "Then mark me," she whispered. Crossing the class line was not a gradual descent, it was a cliff. When Gabriel's rough, calloused hand finally brushed against Isabella's cheek, the world of the nobility shattered. It was the first time she had felt the commoner's touch, warm, honest, and stripped of the cold etiquette of her station. The artist's vision. Gabriel was more than a stable hand. He was a wandering artist, a man who saw the world not as a collection of titles, but as a symphony of light and shadow. In his small, cramped room above the stables, he showed her his sketches. They weren't portraits of dukes or landscapes of manicured gardens. They were drawings of the poor, the weary, and the wild. "This is the world your father ignores," Gabriel said, pointing to a sketch of a coal miner's daughter. "There is more dignity in her dirt than in your father's gold." Isabella realized that her obsession with Gabriel was an obsession with reality. The nobility lived in a velvet vacuum, a place where nothing ever changed and nothing ever died. But Gabriel's world was alive. It was messy, it was dangerous, and she wanted to be part of it. The scandal in the dirt. The commoner's touch soon left its marks. Isabella began to change. She stopped wearing her most restrictive corsets. She allowed her hair to become messy. She spent her afternoons in the village instead of the parlor. The vultures of the ton noticed immediately. "She smells of the stables," Lady Danbury hissed at a garden party. "I saw her talking to that creature, the one who paints," another whispered. The scandal of a high-born lady falling for a commoner was the ultimate entertainment for the elite. It was a story that validated their belief that women were fragile and easily led astray by the lower classes. But for Isabella, it wasn't a delusion. It was a revolution. The confrontation of blood and soil. The Duke, informed by a spy among the grooms, confronted Isabella in the very stables where her sin began. The contrast was cinematic, the Duke in his tailored hunting tweeds and Gabriel in his sweat-stained shirt, holding a pitchfork. "Step away from my daughter, peasant," the Duke commanded, his hand resting on the hilt of his cane. Gabriel didn't flinch. "I am not holding her, your grace. She is holding herself for the first time." The Duke turned to Isabella, his face a mask of cold fury. "Is this the pure bloodline we have protected for centuries? You would soil yourself with a man who lives in the hay, a man whose ancestors were likely my ancestors, serfs." "His ancestors had hearts, father," Isabella said, standing beside Gabriel. "Yours only had ledgers." The Duke's blow was swift. He struck Gabriel across the face with his cane. Blood, red, human, and common, spilled onto the straw. "If you ever speak to him again," the Duke whispered, "I will not just ruin him, I will erase him. And you will be locked in the North Tower until the day you marry the Earl." The power of the touch. That night, Isabella managed to slip out one last time. She found Gabriel in the orchard, his face bruised but his spirit unbroken. "He's right about one thing," Gabriel said, his voice strained. "I am dirt to them, and you are a star. A star shouldn't fall to the mud." Isabella took his hands, both of them, and pressed them against her face. She didn't care about the blood or the charcoal. "The mud is where things grow, Gabriel," she said. "The stars are just cold lights in a dark room. I would rather be dirt with you than a diamond with them." This was the crossing of the line. It was the moment she realized that the commoner's touch had not stained her, it had cleansed her. It had stripped away the layers of false identity until only the woman remained. The escape plan. They knew they couldn't stay. A noblewoman and an artist could not exist in England. They were a walking contradiction. "There is a ship leaving from Liverpool for America," Gabriel whispered. "In America, they don't ask for your father's name. They ask for the strength of your back and the vision in your eyes." "Then let's go," Isabella said. "Let the Vance name die here in the silence. I want a new name. I want your name." The betrayal of class. To leave was the ultimate betrayal. It wasn't just leaving a house, it was leaving a system. Isabella took nothing, not her jewelry, not her fine dresses, not even a change of shoes. She left as she was, a woman of Oakhaven, ready to become a woman of the world. As they rode away in a stolen wagon, Isabella looked back at the manor. It looked small, it looked like a tomb. The gilded cage was finally empty. The new lineage. The chapter ends as the sun rises over the docks of Liverpool. Isabella stands among the hundreds of immigrants, the poor, the common, the unseen. Her silk dress is torn and stained. Her hands are rough from the journey. But when Gabriel touches her hand, she doesn't feel shame. She feels life. The commoner's touch had destroyed her noble life, but it had saved her soul. The paper trail of scandal would follow her, but she didn't care. She was crossing more than a class line. She was crossing into a new century. A highborn lady had fallen, but as she stepped onto the ship, Isabella Vance realized that falling was the only way to find out that she had wings. The whispers of the parlor, the gossip industry. In the grand architecture of the British aristocracy, walls did not just have ears, they had tongues. While the nobility occupied the grand stages of the drawing rooms, a secondary, more dangerous world thrived in the shadows of the servants' quarters and the narrow corridors of the parlor. This was the gossip industry, a relentless machine that turned private whispers into public executions. For Lady Isabella Vance, her escape with Gabriel was not just a flight for freedom. It was the fuel for a fire that would consume her name within 48 hours. The weaponization of silence. Secrets were the only currency the lower class held over their masters. A maid might spend 12 hours scrubbing floors for a few shillings, but a single overheard sentence, a glimpse of a forbidden embrace, or a stained letter found in a wastebasket was worth a fortune in the information market. "Did you see the way she looked at the stable hand?" whispered Mrs. Higgins, the head housekeeper, as she poured tea for the Duke's closest friends. In that one sentence, the weapon was loaded. The parlor was no longer a place of rest. It was a courtroom where Isabella was being tried in her absence. The servants didn't just tell the truth, they curated it. They added adjectives of shame and verbs of betrayal, ensuring that by the time the story reached the ears of the vultures of the ton, it was a full-blown tragedy of moral decay. The anatomy of a rumor. The gossip industry worked in cycles. It started in the kitchen, moved to the dressing rooms, and finally erupted in the high society clubs of London. By Wednesday morning, the rumor had evolved. It was no longer just a look or a conversation. "I heard she gave him her mother's sapphire," said Lady Thorne, snapping her fan shut with the sound of a pistol shot. "They say she was seen at the docks, dressed like a common harlot," replied another, her eyes gleaming with the predatory joy of someone watching a rival fall. This was the public execution of character. It didn't require a guillotine, it only required a lack of defense. Isabella wasn't there to deny the claims, and her father, the Duke, was too proud to acknowledge them. His silence was interpreted as a confession of his daughter's guilt. The betrayal of friends. In the world of the nobility, friendship was often a thin veil for competition. Isabella's closest confidant, Lady Beatrice, was the first to leak the details of Isabella's secret diaries. "I only speak of this out of concern for her soul," Beatrice said, her voice dripping with artificial honey as she sat in a crowded parlor. But Isabella always had a restless spirit. She never understood the sanctity of her bloodline. With those words, Beatrice secured her own standing by distancing herself from the fallen woman. The gossip industry thrived on this, the ritual sacrifice of one noblewoman to ensure the safety of the others. By weaponizing Isabella's secrets, her friends ensured that the stain would not spread to them. The servants' network. We often forget that the servants were the invisible reporters of history. They stood in the corners of rooms, motionless as statues, while the elite discussed their most intimate affairs. "They think we are furniture," Gabriel had once told Isabella, "but furniture doesn't forget, furniture doesn't forgive." The coachman who saw the midnight departure, the footman who found the discarded silk ribbon, the laundress who noticed the scent of the stables on a duchess's gown, they were the architects of the scandal. They sold these news items to the tabloid journals for enough money to buy their own freedom. The destruction of a dynasty was, for them, a career opportunity. The public execution. By Friday, the execution was complete. Isabella's name was no longer spoken with respect. It was a punchline in the gentlemen's clubs and a cautionary tale in the nurseries. The Duke of Vance sat alone in his study, the weight of the whispers pressing down on him like a physical mountain. He realized that he could fight a man in a duel, he could fight a lawsuit in court, but he could not fight a whisper. A whisper has no face, it has no source, it is an atmospheric poison. "They have turned my daughter into a ghost," he whispered to the empty room. The gossip industry had won. It had taken a private romance, a moment of genuine, if forbidden, human connection, and distorted it into a monstrous act of class treason. The public execution was more effective than a prison sentence. It ensured that even if Isabella returned, she would never truly be alive in the eyes of society again. The psychology of the vultures. Why did they do it? Why did society feast on the ruin of one of their own? For the American audience, this is the core of the drama, the crab mentality of the elite. If one woman managed to break the rules and find happiness, it made the others realize they were still in their cages. To justify their own imprisonment, they had to destroy the one who escaped. The whispers were a defense mechanism. By labeling Isabella as insane, corrupt, or ruined, the other noblewomen could go back to their loveless marriages and their suffocating corsets, believing they were the lucky ones. The final echo. The chapter ends with a scene at a London newsstand. A common laborer buys a penny dreadful newspaper. The headline, though not naming her directly, describes the flight of the Sapphire Lady. In the parlor of Oakhaven, the fire has gone out. The servants are quiet now, their pockets heavy with the coins earned from their betrayal. The secrets have been weaponized, the character has been executed, and the gilded cage is now a haunted house. Isabella and Gabriel are on the ocean, unaware that their names are being shredded by the very people they once called family. They are free, but in the world they left behind, they have been erased by the power of a whisper. The legacy of the tongue. The gossip industry remains the most powerful force in the history of noble scandals. It is the bridge between the private sin and the public downfall. As the ship moves further from the shores of England, the whispers begin to fade, replaced by the roar of the Atlantic. But back in the parlors, the vultures are already looking for their next meal. For in the world of the nobility, someone is always whispering, and someone is always listening. When the nobility fell from grace. The alchemist's tonic, secrets of the bedchamber. In the gilded corridors of the 19th century aristocracy, the most dangerous room was not the throne room nor the war cabinet, it was the bedchamber. Behind the heavy oak doors and velvet curtains of noble estates, a secret war was waged, a war for biological survival. For a noblewoman, an inconvenient pregnancy was not just a medical condition. It was a death sentence for her reputation, her family's honor, and her future. This chapter dives into the shadowy world of the alchemist's tonic, the desperate measures taken to erase mistakes, and the dark figures who turned noble desperation into a thriving, illegal industry. The arrival of the shadow. It was 2 in the morning at the Oakhaven Manor. The fog was so thick it seemed to swallow the very stones of the house. Inside, Lady Alara's younger sister, Juliana, sat trembling on the edge of her bed. She was 19, beautiful, and carrying a secret that was growing larger with every passing day. A sharp, rhythmic knock sounded at the servants' entrance, not the knock of a friend, but the cold, clinical knock of a man who dealt in shadows. He was known only as the alchemist, a disgraced physician who had long ago traded his medical license for a bag of forbidden vials and a heart of stone. "Do you have the gold?" he whispered as he was ushered in by a loyal, albeit terrified, lady's maid. In the world of the nobility, gold was the only thing that could buy silence. The alchemist didn't care about the girl's tears, he only cared about the weight of the coin. He pulled a small, brown vial from his coat, a liquid that smelled of bitter almonds and metallic decay. "The tonic is strong," he warned, his eyes reflecting the candlelight like a predator. "It will erase the mistake, but it might erase the mother too. Nature does not like to be cheated, my lady." Life versus honor. For Juliana, the risk of death was preferable to the reality of the scandal. If her pregnancy were discovered, she would be cast out, sent to a convent or a remote colony, her name erased from the family Bible. Her father, the Duke, would rather see her in a coffin than see a bastard child carry the Vance bloodline. This was the core of the noble tragedy. Honor was more valuable than life. She drank the tonic. The taste was like fire and rusted iron. As she collapsed onto the pillows, the alchemist gathered his gold and vanished back into the fog. He was a ghost, a shadowy figure who profited from the very rules he helped the nobility break. He was the dark mirror of their pure society, a man who lived on the wreckage of their hidden sins. Science or sorcery? What was in the alchemist's tonic? In the 1880s, the line between medicine and poison was thin. These tinctures often contained lead, mercury, or high doses of ergot, substances that triggered the body to reject the pregnancy, but often led to organ failure or madness. "We call it mother's ruin in the alleys," a local apothecary once whispered, "but for the ladies of the hill, we call it the restorative tonic, a different name for the same poison." The secrets of the bedchamber were guarded by a silent network of women. Mothers passed down the names of specialists to their daughters like heirlooms. It was a dark sisterhood, born of necessity and maintained by fear. Every noble house had a drawer hidden behind a loose panel, containing dried herbs and unlabeled bottles, the silent evidence of a century of erased histories. The profiteers of shame. The alchemist was not alone. An entire industry existed to service the noble mistake. There were baby farmers who took in unwanted infants for a heavy fee, only for the children to disappear into the industrial slums. There were remote tutors who were actually wardens for pregnant girls sent away to the countryside for their health. These figures were the vultures of the aristocracy. They didn't hate the nobility, they worshipped their scandals, for scandal was their primary source of income. A duke would pay 10 times the price of a house to ensure a mistake never reached the ears of the queen. "Shame is the most profitable crop in England," the alchemist was known to say in the taverns of the East End, "and the Vance family provides a bountiful harvest." The body remembers. While the scandal might be erased from the history books, the body never forgot. Juliana survived the night, but she was never the same. Her skin took on a ghostly pallor and her eyes lost the spark of youth. The alchemist's tonic had done its job, but it had left a hollow shell behind. This was the public mask at its most cruel. Juliana was expected to appear at the breakfast table the next morning, to smile at the guests, and to discuss the upcoming hunt as if she hadn't spent the night in a battle with death. "You look a bit peaked, Juliana," the Duke said, casually buttering his toast. "Perhaps more iron in your diet." The irony was lethal. The iron she had consumed was currently tearing her apart from the inside, but she nodded, her internal silence stronger than ever. The ghost of the unborn. In the quiet hours, the bedchamber became a haunted space. The nobility believed that by erasing the physical evidence, they were erasing the sin, but the mind followed its own rules. Juliana began to hear things, the rustle of a cradle that wasn't there, the cry of a child in the wind. The secrets of the bedchamber were not just biological, they were spectral. Every woman in the Vance line who had taken the tonic became a part of a silent, invisible congregation of the damned. They were the women who broke the rules, but were forced to pretend the rules were still intact. The psychological cost was a slow erosion of the self. They lived in a world where their most profound experiences were unmentionable. The betrayal of the maids. The shadowy figures weren't always outsiders like the alchemist. Sometimes they were the people closest to the bedside. Ladies' maids often acted as the intermediaries, taking a cut of the hush money. I have seen things that would turn the king's hair white, Martha, the maid, confided to a fellow servant. But a secret is like a jewel. The longer you hold it, the more it's worth. The bedchamber was a theater of power dynamics. The maid held the life of the mistress in her hands, and the mistress held the livelihood of the maid in hers. It was a mutual blackmail that defined the domestic life of the nobility. The legacy of the tonic. As the century turned toward the 1900s, the secrets of the bedchamber began to leak out. Medical journals started to report on the epidemic of noble fainting, which was often a code for the after-effects of these illegal tonics. The American audience, looking back at this era, often sees only the romance of the ballrooms, but the true story of the nobility is written in the ledgers of the alchemist. It is a story of desperate women, cold-blooded profiteers, and the terrifying price of maintaining a pure bloodline. The silence of the stone. The chapter ends with Juliana standing at her window, looking out at the family cemetery. There are no stones for the mistakes. There are no records for the tonics. Everything is clean, polished, and false. The alchemist's tonic had saved the House of Vance once again, but as Juliana touched her cold, empty stomach, she realized that they hadn't just saved the honor, they had sacrificed the future. The bedchamber was quiet now, the vials were hidden, the gold was spent, but the secrets remained in the walls, waiting for the next generation of women to break the rules. The duels of honor, men fighting for a woman's shame. In the cold, misty dawns of the late 19th century, honor was not a moral concept. It was a physical commodity, one that was stored in the reputation of the family's women and defended with the cold steel of a rapier or the lead of a dueling pistol. When a scandal broke, when a first transgression was whispered in the clubs of Pall Mall, the men of the house did not reach out to comfort the woman involved. They reached for their weapons. This was not a fight for her safety. It was a ritual of blood to reclaim a lost pride that she had supposedly tarnished. The anatomy of an insult. It started with a glove, or a spilled glass of port, or a look that lingered a second too long. At the White's Club in London, the air was thick with the scent of leather and expensive brandy. Lord Arthur Vance, the Duke's eldest son, sat in a velvet armchair, his face a mask of aristocratic boredom. That boredom shattered when Sir Julian Vane, a man known for his loose tongue and sharper wit, leaned over the card table. "I hear the Oakhaven stables have a new attraction," Julian whispered, loud enough for the surrounding gentlemen to hear. "A stable hand who paints, and a lady who finds his brushwork quite intimate." The room went silent. In that heartbeat, Lady Isabella's life ceased to be her own. She became a shame, a stain on the Vance crest that could only be bleached out with blood. Arthur did not defend his sister's heart, he defended the family's name. He rose slowly, his movements as precise as a clock. He did not ask if the rumor was true. Truth was irrelevant. Perception was everything. He flicked his silk handkerchief across Julian's face, a soft touch that carried the weight of a death sentence. "Hampstead Heath, tomorrow at dawn," Arthur said, his voice a lethal monotone. "Bring your seconds." The woman as a spectator to her own ruin. Back at the manor, Isabella was not consulted. She was not asked why she had fallen for Gabriel, the artist. She was locked in her room while the men discussed the logistics of blood. "Do you understand, Isabella?" her father, the Duke, hissed through the locked door. "If Arthur falls, it is your hand that pulled the trigger. If he kills Vane, it is your shame that sharpened the blade. Either way, you are the ghost in this house." This was the ultimate irony of the duel of honor. The woman was the center of the conflict, yet she was completely invisible within it. Her emotions, her reasons, her very humanity was stripped away. She was merely the shame that provided the excuse for men to exert their dominance over one another. The Ritual of the Dawn. Hampstead Heath at 5:00 a.m. was a place of spectral beauty. The fog clung to the grass like a burial shroud. The two parties met in a secluded hollow, their figures silhouetted against the grey sky. The seconds, men who viewed this violence as a necessary social hygiene, checked the pistols. The Code Duello was a thick book of rules designed to make murder look like etiquette. 10 paces, the referee commanded. Arthur and Julian stood back to back. Arthur felt nothing for his sister. He felt only the cold pressure of the walnut grip in his hand and the crushing weight of 300 years of ancestors watching him from the fog. He wasn't fighting for Isabella's happiness. He was fighting to ensure that no one at the club would ever laugh at a Vance again. The spill of common and noble blood. They turned. The crack of the pistols was a sudden, violent intrusion into the morning. The smell of sulfur filled the air. Julian Vane crumpled to the ground, his hand clutching a blooming red stain on his white linen shirt. Arthur stood still, a grazing wound on his shoulder, a badge of honor he would wear with pride for the rest of his life. Was the scandal gone? No, but it had been settled. In the twisted logic of the nobility, killing the man who spoke the truth was the same as erasing the truth itself. The revenge of the discarded woman. Isabella heard the news from a crying maid. Arthur had lived. Julian was dead. Gabriel, her artist, had been hunted down by the Duke's men and beaten until he could no longer hold a brush, then banished to the colonies. She walked to the great hall where her brother stood, his arm in a sling, receiving the grim congratulations of his peers. "Is the pride reclaimed, Arthur?" she asked, her voice echoing off the stone walls. "Does my shame feel better now that there is a corpse in the ground?" Arthur looked at her with utter contempt. "You should be on your knees thanking me. I have saved your name." "You haven't saved my name," she replied, stepping into the light. "You have merely written it in blood. You didn't fight for me. You fought for the chair you sit in and the coat you wear. You are a coward with a pistol." The cost of honor. The duels of honor were the peak of noble hypocrisy. They were presented as acts of chivalry, but they were actually acts of silencing. By killing the witnesses to their women's rebellion, the men of the house maintained the illusion of control. But the cost was high. For every duel fought, a family was further fractured. The women, seeing the blood spilled in their name, grew colder, more calculated. They realized that if their shame was a weapon the men used for sport, they might as well use that weapon themselves. In the American tabloids of the time, these duels were reported with a mix of horror and fascination. "The savage aristocracy," the headlines read. To the New World, this was proof that the Old World was dying, rotting from the inside out because it valued pride over people. The shadow of the gallows. While the nobility called it a duel, the law was beginning to call it murder. The shadow of the gallows began to loom over these men of honor. Arthur Vance was never charged. The Duke's influence saw to that, but he became a pariah in a different way. He was a man who had killed to hide a sister's heart. He was the embodiment of a system that was becoming obsolete. Isabella, meanwhile, did the one thing her family feared most. She didn't stay to be protected. She took the sapphire they valued so much, sold it to a fence in the East End, and bought a ticket to a world where honor was earned through character, not spilled through lead. Conclusion: the empty altar of pride. The chapter ends with the Duke sitting in his gallery, staring at the portraits of his ancestors. The lineage was secure, the duel was won, the shame was hidden. But the house was silent. His son was a killer, his daughter was gone. The jewels of honor had reclaimed the family's pride, but it had left them with nothing else. They were kings of a graveyard, guarding an altar of pride that had no worshippers left. Blood had been spilled, but it hadn't washed anything clean. It had only left a permanent stain on the floor, a stain that no amount of noble honor could ever scrub away. Stolen inheritance, the battle for the title. In the eyes of the British High Court, a noble title was not just a name, it was a living entity, an ancient beast that required a pure bloodline to survive. But what happens when the beast is fed a lie? The 9th chapter of our chronicle delves into the stolen inheritance, the moment when the heavy oak doors of Oakhaven were rattled not by an invading army, but by the legal claim of an illegitimate son. This was the ultimate nightmare for the nobility, a scandal that didn't just ruin a reputation, but threatened to transfer a 1,000-year legacy into the hands of a baseless outsider. The arrival of the writ. The afternoon was grey and uncharacteristically silent when a black carriage, bearing no crest, pulled up to the Vance estate. A man in a sharp, soot-colored suit stepped out. He was not a lord, he was a solicitor from the city, a man whose briefcase held enough paper to set the entire manor on fire. Inside the great hall, the Duke of Vance sat by the fire, his hands knotted like the roots of an old oak. The solicitor, a man named Mr. Grave, did not bow. He simply handed over a parchment sealed with the wax of the Chancery Court. "Your Grace," Grave said, his voice as dry as old vellum, "I represent a young man named Julian Vance, or as he has been known in the colonies, Julian Smith. He claims to be the firstborn son of your late brother, Lord Edward, and he has the church records to prove it." The Duke's heart stalled. Edward, the wild brother, the one who had disappeared into the shadows of a common romance before dying in a fever-ridden port. The family had buried Edward's memory, now his shame had returned to claim the crown. The anatomy of the claim. The legal drama of stolen inheritance was a surgical process. For an American audience, it is important to understand that in this world, there was no such thing as a half-right to a title. You were either the heir or you were nothing. Julian's claim was built on a secret marriage, the most dangerous weapon in a legal arsenal. It was whispered that Lord Edward had married a tavern-keeper's daughter in a small village chapel before fleeing the country. If that marriage was valid, Julian was not a bastard. He was the rightful duke. "The law of the land is clear," Mr. Grave continued, ignoring the duke's visible rage. "The title follows the blood of the firstborn. If Julian is legitimate, your son Arthur is merely a commoner with an expensive education. The manor, the lands, and the seat in Parliament, they all belong to the boy from the docks." The battle in the Court of Chancery. The trial that followed was a spectacle of the century. The courtrooms were packed with the elite, who came not for justice, but to watch a dynasty bleed. The Duke's lawyers, expensive, silver-tongued men, argued that the marriage was a forgery, a scandalous fabrication by a social climber. They brought in witnesses who swore the tavern girl was of loose character. They weaponized class prejudice, hoping the judges would refuse to see a peasant as a peer of the realm. But Julian was different. He didn't arrive in rags. He arrived in a suit of quiet dignity, his face bearing the unmistakable Vance jawline, a physical paper trail that no lawyer could erase. "I do not seek your gold," Julian testified, his voice ringing through the hall. "I seek the truth of my mother's name. She was not a mistake. She was a wife, and I am not a scandal. I am the son." The weaponization of the secret. As the legal battle intensified, the vultures of the ton circled. If Julian won, every noble family in England would look at their own history with terror. How many secret marriages were hidden in their closets? How many illegitimate children were waiting in the shadows to claim their stolen inheritance? The Duke realized that he couldn't win on law alone. He had to use the scandal industry. He began to leak stories to the press, stories of Julian's criminal past in America, stories of his mother's madness. It was a public execution of character designed to influence the judges. "If we cannot prove him a liar," the Duke whispered to Arthur, We must prove him a monster. The crown will never give a title to a man the public fears. The Stained Register. The climax of the drama centered on a single, moth-eaten book, the marriage register of a forgotten church in Cornwall. The Duke's men had tried to buy the book. They had even tried to burn the church. But the commoners' network, the servants and the villagers who hated the Vance arrogance, had protected the evidence. When the book was opened in court, the room went silent. There it was, Edward Vance to Mary Miller, June 14, 1858. The ink was faded, stained by time and dampness, but the signatures were legal. The stolen inheritance was no longer a theory, it was a fact. The scandal had become a legal reality. The fall of the House of Vance. The judgment was a thunderclap. The court ruled in favor of Julian. The scene that followed at Oakhaven was one of Greek tragedy. The Duke, a man who had spent his life guarding the purity of the line, was ordered to vacate the premises. Arthur, the heir who had fought duels for his pride, was now a man with no name and no future. "You fought for a title, father," Arthur said, watching the servants begin to pack the trunks. "But you forgot to fight for the people. Now we are the ghosts. And the scandal is the master of the house." The nobility watched in horror as the commoner Duke took his seat. Julian didn't change the manor, he opened it. He invited the villagers to the gardens. He stopped the gilded cage from suffocating those within. He proved that an illegitimate son could be more noble than the pure heirs who came before him. The psychological aftermath. The stolen inheritance changed the psychology of the British elite. It proved that a title was a fragile thing, held together only by the silence of the past. For the American audience, this represents the death of the old world. It is the moment when blood lost to truth. Julian Vance became a symbol of a new era, an era where a man's worth was determined by his character, not by the secret tonics of his mother's bedchamber. The final legal tally. The Duke died 6 months later, not of illness, but of loss of status, a condition the physicians of the time recognized but couldn't cure. He died in a small, rented house in London, still clutching his old signet ring. Arthur disappeared into the back streets of Paris, a shadow of his former self. Julian, the stolen heir, sat in the great hall. He looked at the portraits of the ancestors. He didn't remove them. He added one, a simple, unadorned painting of his mother, the tavern keeper's daughter. Conclusion: the new lineage. The battle for the title was over, but the paper trail of scandal had left its mark. The Vance name survived, but it was transformed. It was no longer a gilded cage. It was a house with open windows. The lesson was clear. You can hide a child, you can burn a letter, and you can fight a duel. But you cannot stop the truth from claiming its inheritance. Exile to the countryside, the living death. In the brutal lexicon of the 19th century aristocracy, there was a fate far worse than a public scandal or a swift death. It was the living death, the systematic removal of a rebellious woman from the eyes of the world. When a lady broke the rules too often, when she loved the wrong man or spoke the forbidden truth, she wasn't always sent to a convent. Often she was sent to the exile, a crumbling, forgotten estate in the damp reaches of the north, far from the lights of London and the warmth of human society. For Lady Alara Vance, this was the final price of her defiance. The verdict of the silent. The decision to exile Alara was not made in a court of law. It was made over a decanter of port in the Duke's library. There were no judges, only family members who feared the stain she brought upon the Vance name. "The girl is a contagion," her uncle, Lord Reginald, had muttered. "If she remains in the city, her madness will infect the younger sister's marriage prospects. She must be quarantined." The word was a dagger, quarantined, as if her desire for a life of her own was a physical disease. Within 24 hours, Alara was stripped of her silk gowns, her jewelry, and her books. She was placed in a black, windowless carriage, a hearse for the living, and driven toward Blackwood Manor, an estate that hadn't seen a guest in 40 years. The architecture of despair. Blackwood Manor sat on the edge of a desolate moor, its stones blackened by damp and its windows staring out like blind eyes. To an American audience, it would resemble the set of a Gothic horror film, but for Ilara, it was a literal prison. The air here didn't smell of perfume or expensive tobacco. It smelled of wet earth and slow decay. There were no balls here, no masquerades, no whispers in the parlor. There was only the sound of the wind howling through the cracks in the masonry, a sound that seemed to mock the gilded cage she had once complained about. "Welcome to your new life, my lady," the housekeeper, Mrs. Crane, said. Mrs. Crane was not a servant. She was a jailer, a woman paid by the Duke to ensure that Ilara remained silent, invisible, and miserable. The psychology of isolation. The living death worked by eroding the sense of self. In the city, Ilara was the beautiful Lady Vance. In exile, she was no one. Weeks turned into months. The routine was a weapon of psychological warfare. Breakfast in silence, a walk in the walled garden where the walls were 10 feet high and topped with broken glass, dinner in silence, bed by 8, no letters were allowed out, no news was allowed in. "They are waiting for you to forget who you are," a young maid, hired from the local village, whispered to her one night. "That's how the exile ends. When you look in the mirror and don't recognize the face, they've won." Ilara began to understand the cruelty of her class. They didn't want to kill her body, they wanted to kill her spirit. They wanted her to become a hollow vessel so that, years later, she could be brought back as a cautionary tale of a woman who had been broken by her own rebellion. The Society of Ghosts. Ilara soon discovered she was not the first Vance woman to be sent to Blackwood. In the attic, she found discarded trunks filled with dresses from the 1840s, letters never sent, poems written in the margins of Bibles, and locks of hair from children long since taken away. This was the exile's legacy. Blackwood was a repository for the unruly women of the dynasty. Every generation had one, the aunt who went mad, the cousin who died of a broken heart. "We are the footnotes of the family tree," Ilara whispered as she read the diary of a woman named Margaret who had lived in this room 30 years prior. "The silence is a hunger," Margaret had written. "It eats your memories first, then it starts on your dreams." The fight for sanity. To survive the living death, Ilara had to create a world inside her head. Since she was dennied ink, she used charcoal from the fireplace to write on the undersides of the floorboards. Since she was dennied music, she memorized the rhythm of the rain. She realized that the commoner's touch she had craved was not just about romance, it was about the reality of the struggle. The peasants in the fields outside Blackwood were poor, but they were not ghosts. They were allowed to scream. They were allowed to love. One afternoon, Ilara managed to climb to the roof. She looked out over the moor and saw a flickering light in a distant cottage. It was a sign of life, a reminder that the world still existed. "I am still here," she shouted into the wind. "I am Ilara Vance, I am alive." Mrs. Crane dragged her down and locked her in the cellar for 3 days, but the damage was done. Ilara had remembered herself. The visit. After a year of isolation, the Duke arrived. He didn't come to bring her home, he came to verify the cure. He sat across from her in the damp drawing room, looking at her ragged dress and her pale, thin face. He saw the fire in her eyes and mistook it for fever. "Are you ready to be a daughter again, Ilara?" he asked, his voice smooth and cold. "The Earl of Sutherland is still willing to take you as a project of redemption. You will apologize to the family, you will marry him, and we will never speak of the stable hand or the masquerade again." Ilara looked at her father, the architect of her misery. She looked at the man who preferred a broken doll to a living daughter. "I would rather die in this dust," she said, her voice sounding like a ghost, but with the edge of a blade. "At least here the walls don't lie. I am not your project. I am the woman you couldn't break." The living death becomes a life. The Duke left, declaring her incurably insane. The exile became permanent, but something strange happened. Without the pressure of the gilded cage, without the need for the choreographed performance, Ilara began to find a different kind of freedom. She made alliances with the village girls who brought the laundry. She taught them to read. She used her remaining knowledge of the family's secrets to blackmail Mrs. Crane into allowing her more freedom within the grounds. The exile was supposed to be a prison, but Ilara turned it into a sanctuary. She became the Lady of the Moor, a legend whispered about by the locals, a woman who had been cast out by the nobility and found her soul in the shadows. The empty portrait. In London, at the Vance Manor, a portrait was removed from the gallery. A space was left empty on the wall where Ilara's face should have been. To the world, she was dead. But in the crumbling estate of Blackwood, far from the lights of the city, a woman sat by a fire she had built herself. She was no longer a lady. She had no currency, no reputation, and no title. She had something better. She had the silence, and for the first time in her life, she wasn't afraid to speak into it. The living death was over. The life of Ilara Vance had finally begun. Hey guys, tonight the gilded cage, life behind the velvet curtain. The air inside the manor of Oakhaven did not circulate. It simply lingered, heavy with the scent of beeswax, expensive lilies, and the suffocating weight of 300 years of ancestors staring down from oil paintings. For Lady Ilara Vance, every breath felt like a negotiation with the corset cinched tight against her ribs. It was a garment that did more than shape her waist. It defined her very existence. In the year 1884, for the women of the high nobility, reputation was not merely a social asset. It was the only currency they possessed. To lose it was to become a ghost while still drawing breath. In the grandest ballrooms of New York and the ancient estates of England, the rules were the same. A woman must be seen, but never truly known. Ilara stood before the floor-to-ceiling mirror, her reflection a stranger in shimmering midnight blue silk. Her maid, Martha, worked in a practiced, heavy silence, pinning a sapphire brooch to a lace collar so high it chafed the skin of Ilara's throat. There was a specific way a lady of the House of Vance was expected to stand. Chin parallel to the floor, shoulders retracted, eyes bright but never predatory. "The carriage is ready, my lady," Martha whispered. Her voice was barely audible over the crackle of the hearth. Ilara did not nod. A nod was too sharp, too sudden. Instead, she allowed her eyelids to flutter, a soft, choreographed acknowledgement. This was the performance. From the moment she opened her eyes at dawn until the moment she blew out the bedside candle, her life was a series of rehearsed movements. Every step was measured. Every smile was a calculated gift. To the outside world, Oakhaven was a palace of dreams. To Ilara, it was a gilded cage, and the bars were made of velvet, lace, and unyielding etiquette. The architecture of a prison. As Ilara descended the grand staircase, the sheer scale of her confinement became apparent. The architecture of noble life was designed to ensure that no one was ever truly alone. The corridors were long and echoing, designed so that the rustle of a dress could be heard from 30 yards away. The windows were vast, not to let the light in, but to allow the world to look in, to verify that the Vance family was as perfect as the legends suggested. There was a specific cruelty to the velvet curtain. It was the soft, beautiful layer of luxury that muffled the cries of the women trapped behind it. Ilara's mother, the late Duchess, had died in this house. She hadn't died of a fever, but of a slow, agonizing quietude. Ilara remembered her mother's hands, always trembling slightly as she embroidered flowers on silk, over and over, until the fabric was more thread than silk. "Don't let them see the tremble, Ilara," her mother had once whispered, moments before her passing. "The world feeds on the tremors of noble women. If you shake, they will tear you apart." Now standing at the base of the stairs, Ilara felt that same tremble in her marrow, but she suppressed it. She buried it beneath layers of poise and the icy coldness of her sapphire jewels. The weight of the name. Her father, the Duke of Vance, stood by the mahogany doors. He was a man whose heartbeat seemed timed to the ticking of the grandfather clock in the great hall. To him, his daughter was not a person. She was the ultimate masterpiece, a living vessel for the family's prestige and a bargaining chip for a future alliance. "A Vance woman," he said, his voice like grinding stones, "does not walk, she glides. She does not speak, she orates. Remember, Ilara, the eyes of the city are upon you tonight. One slip, one unscripted laugh, and the vultures will circle. The expectations were absolute. Ilara had been trained since the age of 5 to master the internal silence. It was the art of keeping one's thoughts so deeply buried that even the most observant gossip-monger at a royal ball could not find a crack in the porcelain mask. But beneath the silk, Ilara's heart beat with a frantic, rebellious rhythm. She remembered the books she had hidden beneath the floorboards of her dressing room, treatises on philosophy and poetry that spoke of the soul's wild longing. In those pages, women were not ornaments, they were fires, but in the drawing rooms of the elite, fire was something to be contained within a hearth, or it was extinguished. The Equinox Ball. The carriage ride to the city was a journey through a world of shadows. As the wheels churned the gravel, Ilara watched the dark trees pass by, imagining they were sentinels guarding her prison. Tonight was the Equinox Ball, the most prestigious event of the social season. In the high society of the late 19th century, this ball was where destinies were decided. It was where marriages were brokered and where reputations were executed with a single whisper behind a fan. When the carriage doors opened, the roar of the city hit her, the smell of coal smoke, the clatter of horses, and the blinding light of the new electric street lamps. The flashing bulbs of photographers felt like lightning. "Smile, Ilara," her father commanded under his breath. She obeyed. It was a perfect, vacant smile. The ballroom was a sea of white ties and shimmering gowns. Thousands of candles flickered in crystal chandeliers, casting a golden glow that made everything look more beautiful and more false than it truly was. This was the choreographed performance in its highest form. Every bow, every curtsy, every sip of champagne was part of a grand, invisible script. The whispers of the tongue. As Ilara moved through the crowd, she felt the weight of 1,000 gazes. The vultures of the tongue, the elder matrons who held the power of social life and death, sat on the perimeter, their fans snapping open and shut like the wings of birds of prey. "Did you see the stitching on her gown?" one whispered. "Is it true she refused the Earl of Sutherland?" another hissed. Every movement was scrutinized, the way she held her fan, the angle at which she tilted her head when speaking to a suitor, the number of seconds she allowed a man to hold her hand during a waltz. To an outsider, it was a party. To Ilara, it was a minefield. She waltzed with men whose names she forgot the moment the music stopped. Their hands were gloved, their words were empty, and their eyes were always looking past her, looking at the Vance fortune she represented. "You dance with exquisite precision, Lady Ilara," said Lord Stirling, a man whose breath smelled of expensive cigars and cold ambition. "Precision is the only thing that keeps us from falling, my lord," she replied. It was a scripted answer, but for the first time, she felt the irony of it. The first crack in the mask. It happened during the third waltz. The orchestra was playing a sweeping, melancholic piece by Strauss. The room was spinning in a blur of gold and white, and then, near the balcony entrance, she saw him. He was not wearing a white tie. He was not wearing a mask of indifference. He was a man standing in the shadows, an outsider. His coat was well cut but worn at the elbows. He was not looking at her jewelry, nor her father, nor the room. He was looking at her, straight into her eyes, as if he could see the internal silence she worked so hard to maintain. For a split second, Ilara's footwork faltered. It was the smallest of errors, a heartbeat's delay in a life of perfect timing. Lord Stirling frowned, his grip on her waist tightening. "Are you unwell, Lady Ilara?" "The heat, my lord," she whispered, her voice trembling just enough for her to notice. "It is overwhelming." She broke away from the dance, a breach of etiquette that caused a ripple of hushed conversations to spread through the room like a virus. She ignored the burning gaze of her father. She ignored the snapping fans of the matrons. She stepped out onto the balcony, into the cold, night air. The cost of a moment. Outside, the city breathed. The air was cold, damp, and honest. Ilara gripped the stone railing, her knuckles turning white. The sapphire brooch felt like a lead weight on her chest. She realized in that moment that she had spent 24 years perfecting a dance for an audience she despised. She was a Vance, She was noble, she was perfect, and she was utterly, completely empty. The man from the shadows followed her out. He didn't speak immediately. He stood at the other end of the balcony, lighting a cigarette, a vulgar, common act that should have offended her. Instead, it fascinated her. "The music sounds better from out here," he said. His voice wasn't polished like a nobleman, it had the grit of the real world in it. "You can hear the mistakes the violinists make when they think no one is listening." Ilara should have walked away. She should have called for her father, but the gilded cage had just developed its first crack. "I didn't think anyone was allowed to notice mistakes in this house," Ilara said, her voice sounding strange to her own ears. It wasn't the voice of a lady, it was the voice of a woman. "Everyone notices," the man replied, looking out at the city lights. "They just spend a lot of money to pretend they don't. But you're the best actor in the room, or the most tired." The breaking of the rules. That conversation lasted less than 5 minutes. To the American audience reading this, 5 minutes might seem like nothing. But in the world of the 1880s nobility, 5 minutes of unchaperoned conversation with a stranger was a scandal. It was a match struck in a room full of gunpowder. When Ilara returned to the ballroom, the atmosphere had changed. The whispers were sharper. Her father's face was a mask of suppressed rage. The velvet curtain was being pulled back, and what lay beneath was not pretty. As she was ushered back to the carriage, her father leaned in, his voice a lethal whisper. "You have embarrassed the name. You have stepped out of the choreography. There will be consequences, Ilara. A woman's reputation is like glass. Once cracked, it can never be mended." The aftermath. The days that followed were a living death. Ilara was confined to her rooms. The books under the floorboards were found and burned. Martha, her only friend, was dismissed without a reference. This was how the nobility handled rebellion, not with chains, but with isolation. They stripped away everything that made a woman an individual until she was forced to beg for the return of her cage. Ilara sat by the window of Oakhaven, watching the rain wash over the ancient stone. She was being watched. Every letter she wrote was screened. Every meal was brought to her on a silver tray by a stranger. She was being re-educated in the art of being a Vance. But her father was wrong about one thing. Glass, once cracked, does not just become ugly, it becomes sharp. In the silence of her room, Ilara realized that the suffocating expectations only had power if she feared the alternative. The reputation she had worked so hard to maintain was a lie. The choreographed performance was a play that had reached its final act. The midnight realization. It was now midnight, 3 weeks after the ball. Ilara stood in the center of her room. She looked at the midnight blue silk dress, now draped over a chair like a discarded skin. She realized that the scandals of noble families, the ones people whispered about for centuries, weren't started by bad women. They were started by women who had finally realized that the gilded cage was only a prison if you stayed inside the bars. She thought of the man on the balcony. She didn't love him, she didn't even know his name, but he had given her a gift, the knowledge that the world outside was messy, flawed, and real. Every movement from now on would no longer be choreographed by her father or the vultures of the ton. Ilara walked to the mirror. She didn't look at her posture. She didn't check her chin. She looked at her eyes. For the first time, the internal silence was gone. In its place was a loud, roaring defiance. The end of the performance. The scandal was coming. She could feel it in the air, like the electricity before a storm. In the chapters to follow, the world would see the house of Vance crumble. They would see a daughter turn against a father, a bride flee from a gold-rimmed altar, and a woman trade her sapphires for a chance to breathe. As the clock in the hall struck 1, Lady Ilara Vance did something she had never done in 24 years. She opened the window herself. She let the cold, midnight air ruin the expensive lace curtains. She let the rain dampen the silk carpets. And as she looked out into the dark, she didn't see a prison. She saw a beginning. The velvet curtain was finally, irrevocably torn. Bloodlines and betrayals, the pressure of the heir. The obsession with pure lineage was not merely a family preference, it was a religious devotion at the Manor of Oakhaven. Here, the blood that flowed through one's veins was considered more sacred than the soul itself. For Duchess Genevieve Vance, the weight of this blood had become a strangling cord, one that tightened with every tick of the clock. In the high-stakes world of the 19th century nobility, a woman's primary function was to be a conduit. She was a bridge between the glory of the past and the uncertainty of the future. If she failed to produce an heir, the bridge collapsed, and the family name was swept away into the dark rivers of history. The sacred duty. Genevieve sat in the solarium, the morning sun streaming through stained glass windows that depicted the heroic deeds of Vance men from centuries ago. Across from her sat the Duke, her husband, a man who looked at her not as a partner, but as a prestigious investment that had yet to yield a return. "The physician will arrive at noon, Genevieve," the Duke said, his voice as cold as the marble floors. He didn't look up from his ledger. "This is the 4th specialist this year. The Crown is asking questions. The lineage must be secured." Genevieve felt a cold shiver. The Crown. In their world, the Queen was not just a monarch. She was the ultimate judge of a family's worth. A noble house without an heir was seen as a rotting tree, a waste of fertile soil. "I am aware of my duty, Arthur," she replied softly. Her voice was steady, but her fingers were trembling beneath the silk of her skirts. "Duty," he spat the word, finally looking up. His eyes were hard. "Duty is not a feeling, Genevieve. It is a biological necessity. The Vance bloodline has remained pure for 10 generations. It will not end with me, and it certainly will not end because of your delicate constitution." The shadow of the heart. What Arthur did not know, what no one could ever know, was that Genevieve's heart had long ago wandered away from the cold stone of Oakhaven. 2 years ago, during a summer retreat to the rugged coast of Scotland, she had met Julian. He was a man of the earth, a landscape architect with hands that knew the texture of soil and the secrets of growing things. He didn't care about pure lineages or the weight of crowns. When he looked at her, he didn't see a duchess. He saw a woman trapped in a storm. Their affair had been brief, a fever dream of stolen glances and whispered promises in the salt-sprayed mist, but it had left a mark on her soul that no physician could erase. Julian represented everything the nobility feared: passion without profit and love without a ledger. Now, as she sat in the suffocating luxury of the solarium, the memory of Julian's warmth was the only thing keeping her from shattering. The physician's verdict. The physician, a man named Dr. Sterling, arrived with the punctual cruelty of a tax collector. He was a man of science who spoke of women's bodies as if they were complex machines that simply needed more oil or a tighter screw. The examination was a humiliation, a clinical invasion of privacy that was deemed necessary for the state. Genevieve lay on the bed, staring at the intricate carvings on the ceiling, imagining she was a bird flying far above the manor. Afterward, in the Duke's study, the air was thick with the smell of leather and stale tobacco. "The Duchess is physically capable," Dr. Sterling said, choosing his words with surgical precision. "However, the stress of the expectations may be the barrier, or perhaps," he paused, glancing at the Duke, "perhaps the fault lies not in the soil, but in the seed." The Duke's face turned a dangerous shade of crimson. "That is impossible. The Vance blood is perfect." "Of course, Your Grace," the doctor bowed, sensing the danger. "But if a pure heir is not produced within the next year, the crown may look toward your cousin, Lord Alastair, to inherit the titles." Genevieve, listening from behind the heavy oak door, felt a sudden, terrifying rush of clarity. Lord Alastair was a cruel, gambling drunkard who would sell Oakhaven for a night at the tables. The pure lineage was about to be handed to a monster, all for the sake of a rule written in ancient ink. The conflict of desires. That night, Genevieve walked the gallery of heirs, a long hallway lined with portraits of Vance's sons. Each face was more rigid than the last. They were men of war, men of law, men of cold, unyielding duty. She looked at her own reflection in the glass, covering a portrait of the third Duke. She saw a woman whose heart's desire was to run, to find Julian, to live in a cottage by the sea, to be free of the duty to the crown. But then she thought of the people of the estate, the hundreds of servants, farmers, and families whose lives depended on the stability of the Vance name. If Alistair took over, they would be ruined. This was the betrayal. Her heart wanted freedom, but her position demanded a sacrifice. To save the house, she had to destroy herself. The secret meeting. Desperation drives even the most noble of women to the shadows. Genevieve knew that if she could not conceive an heir with the Duke, she had two choices: accept the fall of the house or commit the ultimate sin against the bloodline. She sent a coded letter. 3 days later, a man appeared at the edge of the estate, not Julian, but someone Julian had trusted, a messenger. "He is in London," the messenger whispered in the darkness of the Willow Grove. "He waits for you every Tuesday at the gallery near the docks. He hasn't forgotten the mist, my lady." Genevieve's breath hitched. The docks, the demimonde, a duchess could not be seen there. It would be the end of her reputation. It would be a scandal that would burn Oakhaven to the ground. And yet, the thought of a child born of love rather than duty, a child who could save the estate from Alistair. It was the ultimate betrayal of the pure bloodline. To save the name, she would have to pollute the lineage with the blood of a commoner. The irony was a bitter pill. The performance of the Duchess. The following weeks were a masterpiece of deception. Genevieve became the perfect wife. She attended every tea, smiled at every boring gala, and played the part of the devoted Duchess with such skill that even Arthur began to relax. "I am glad to see you have accepted your role, Genevieve," he said one evening, patting her hand with a cold, possessive pride. "The crown is pleased with our renewed efforts." Genevieve smiled. It was the smile of a predator. Every Tuesday, she claimed to be visiting her sick aunt or attending a charity meeting for fallen women. In reality, she was shedding her silks for a plain wool cloak and disappearing into the fog of London. In the small, dimly lit room near the docks, the duty to the crown vanished. In Julian's arms, she wasn't a duchess, she wasn't a vessel, she was a woman. "If they find us, Genevieve," Julian whispered into her hair one rainy afternoon. "They won't," she said, though she knew the gossips of the nobility had eyes everywhere. "And if they do, let the world burn. I would rather be a sinner in your arms than a saint in a cold bed." The burden of the secret. Months passed, the air at Oakhaven grew tense, and then the announcement came. The Duchess was with child. The bells of the village church rang for 3 days. The Duke was insufferable in his triumph. He threw a banquet that cost a fortune, toasted to the pure Vance blood, and even received a personal letter of congratulations from the palace. But for Genevieve, the joy was a hollow, haunting thing. Every time Arthur touched her stomach, she felt a wave of nausea. He was celebrating a victory that wasn't his. He was worshipping a bloodline that she had secretly severed. She looked at the portraits of the ancestors. "I have saved your house," she thought, "but I have ended your line. This child will have the Vance name, but the heart of a rebel." The betrayal within. The pressure of the heir did not end with pregnancy, it intensified. Now the Duke was obsessed with purity more than ever. He controlled her diet, her movements, and even the air she breathed. "Nothing must tarnish the boy," Arthur insisted. He was convinced it was a boy. No excitement, no unseemly books, no wandering in the gardens. Genevieve felt like a prisoner in a golden tower. The betrayal was no longer just about Julian, it was about the lie she had to tell her own child. This child would grow up in a world of masks, never knowing their true father, forever carrying the weight of a stolen title. One night, Arthur found her crying in the nursery. "Why do you weep?" he asked, his voice lacking any real empathy. "You have achieved everything a woman is born for." "I weep for the truth, Arthur," she whispered, though he didn't understand. "The truth is in the blood," he replied, pointing to the family crest on the cradle. "And the blood is pure." The Shattered Mirror. The chapter ends on the eve of the birth. A storm is raging over Oakhaven, much like the one Genevieve remembers from Scotland. She stands before her mirror, her body heavy with the secret that could destroy an empire. She has done her duty. She has secured the pure lineage in the eyes of the law, but she knows that from this moment on, her life is a beautiful lie. The Duchess realizes that she has broken every rule of her class. She has betrayed her husband, her king, and her ancestors, and as the first pangs of labor begin, she smiles through the pain. The gilded cage is still there, but the bird inside has already flown. The heir is coming, but the bloodline is no longer pure. It is human, and in the world of the nobility, that is the greatest scandal of all. Midnight at the Masquerade, the first transgression. The Venice of the North, London, was draped in a thick, sulphurous fog, but inside the walls of the Pemberton estate, the air was crystalline, filled with the scent of French perfume and the forbidden heat of 500 bodies. Tonight was the grand masquerade. In a world where every noblewoman's life was a public ledger, the mask was not a tool for deception. It was a tool for liberation. For Lady Isabella Vance, the mask, a delicate creation of silver lace and raven feathers, felt lighter than the skin on her own face. Behind the silk, she was no longer a daughter, a sister, or a future bride to a decaying earl. She was simply a woman. The philosophy of the mask. In the Victorian era, identity was a rigid structure. You were your title, you were your father's reputation. But the masquerade was the one night where the rules were suspended. If the face was hidden, the soul was allowed to speak. Isabella moved through the ballroom, her gown of obsidian silk rustling like the wings of a predatory bird. Her father, the Duke, was somewhere in the sea of harlequins and Caesars, likely discussing timber tariffs. He wouldn't recognize his own daughter. She had practiced a different walk, a slower, more sensual glide that discarded the stiff choreography of the Oakhaven halls. The beauty of a mask, she whispered to herself, is that it makes everyone honest, because they believe no one is watching. The atmosphere of sin. The orchestra played a waltz that sounded like a fever dream. The tempo was slightly too fast, a deliberate choice to stir the blood. Everywhere Isabella looked, the first transgressions were happening in plain sight. In a velvet-drenched corner, a married marchioness was leaning too close to a young poet. Behind a marble pillar, a captain of the guard was whispering something into the ear of a bishop's daughter. The air was thick with it, the scandalous pulse of a nobility that was tired of being perfect. Isabella felt a strange, electric tension in her limbs. She didn't want a poet. She didn't want a captain. She wanted something she couldn't name, a spark to burn down the gilded cage of her upbringing. The chance encounter. She reached the balcony, the cold air biting at her exposed shoulders, and there he was. He was not wearing a costume of a king or a hero. He wore a simple midnight black suit and a mask of plain, matte leather, no feathers, no jewels. He stood with his back to the party, looking out at the dark Thames, a glass of dark amber liquid in his hand. Isabella stepped forward. A proper lady would have waited for an introduction. A proper lady would have retreated. But Isabella was behind the silver lace. "The moon is hiding tonight," she said, her voice dropping an octave, becoming silkier. Perhaps even the sky felt the need to wear a mask. The man turned slowly. His eyes, visible through the leather slits, were a piercing, unreadable gray. He didn't bow. He didn't recite a rehearsed compliment. "The moon doesn't hide because it's afraid, my lady," he replied. His voice was a low hum, the kind of sound that resonates in the chest rather than the ears. "It hides because it's bored of being stared at. I imagine you feel the same." Isabella's heart skipped. It wasn't just the words, it was the way he looked at her. He wasn't looking at her jewelry or her dress. He was looking at the way her breath caught in her throat. The dance of shadows. "Do I know you?" she asked, the question being a dangerous game. "In this room, no one knows anyone," he said, stepping closer. The scent of sandalwood and rain-soaked earth drifted from him. "That is the point of the game, isn't it? to be strangers for 3 hours so we can endure being ourselves for the rest of the year. He held out a hand. It wasn't a gloved hand. It was bare, warm, calloused, and utterly real. "One dance," he whispered. "No names, no titles, just the music." Taking his hand was the first transgression. The moment Isabella's bare skin touched his, she felt a jolt that went deeper than any corset could reach. He led her not to the center of the ballroom, but to the shadow gallery, a dimly lit annex where the music was muffled and the chaperones were absent. They didn't waltz. They moved in a slow, primitive rhythm that the Oakhaven dance masters would have called scandalous. He held her a fraction of an inch too close. His hand on her waist was a firm, possessive weight. The spark of obsession. "You aren't like the others," Isabella murmured, her head leaning back. "You don't smell like the parlor, you smell like the world." "The world is a dangerous place for a lady of Vance," he said. She froze. "You know who I am." He chuckled, a dark, rich sound. "I know the Vance sapphire when I see it, even behind a raven feather mask. But tonight, you aren't the Duke's daughter. You are the woman who wants to jump off the balcony just to see if she can fly." The accuracy of his words was terrifying. It sparked something in her, an obsession not just with the man, but with the version of herself he saw. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice trembling. "I am the man who will make you forget your rules," he whispered, his lips inches from her ear. "I am the scandal your father fears. I am Lucian, a man with no title and a great deal of memory." The midnight kiss. The clock began to strike 12, the hour of unmasking, the hour when the dream ends and the reality of the noble name returns. "I have to go," Isabella said, though she didn't move. "Then go," Lucian said, his eyes challenging her. "Run back to your cold bed and your prayer books, or stay for the truth." He didn't wait for an answer. He leaned in, and in the shadow of a velvet curtain, Lady Isabella Vance committed the ultimate sin. The kiss was not the chaste, dry peck of a suitor. It was a collision. It tasted of whiskey, rebellion, and the terrifying freedom of being ruined. For Isabella, the world vanished. The Oakhaven walls, the Duke's ledgers, the duty to the crown, it all burned away in the heat of a single transgression. The hunger begins. When the final chime of midnight faded, Isabella pulled away, breathless. The ballroom was loud with the sound of people removing masks, laughing, and reclaiming their boring lives. But Isabella didn't remove her mask. She couldn't. She turned and fled through the side exit, her black silk dress snagging on the rose bushes in the garden. She reached her carriage, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. As she rode back to the manor, the silence of the night felt unbearable. The gilded cage didn't just feel like a prison anymore, it felt like a tomb. She looked at her hand, the hand he had held. She could still feel the warmth of his skin. She was obsessed, not with a man she barely knew, but with the feeling of breaking. She wanted to break the rules. She wanted to break the lineage. She wanted to see how far she could fall before she hit the ground. The letter in the dark. Back in her room, Isabella stripped off the finery. She looked at the silver mask on her dressing table. It looked dead now, a hollow shell. Then she noticed a small slip of paper tucked into the bodice of her dress. She didn't know when he had put it there. "The masquerade is over, but the shadows remain. If you want to breathe again, come to the Blackfriars Bridge at dawn on Thursday. Bring nothing but your courage." There was no signature. Isabella sat on the edge of her bed. She knew that if she went, there would be no turning back. The first transgression would lead to a second, a third, and eventually the total destruction of her noble life. She thought of her father, she thought of the vultures of the Tun, and then she thought of Lucian's eyes. The descent. Isabella blew out the candle, but for the first time in her life, she wasn't afraid of the dark. The dark was where Lucian was, the dark was where she could be herself. In the world of noble families, a scandal is often described as a tragedy. But as Isabella lay there, watching the moon finally emerge from the clouds, she knew the truth. A scandal is simply the price of freedom, and she was more than willing to pay it. The obsession had taken root, the first rule had been broken, and inside the House of Vance, the first stone had just been pulled from the foundation. Letters from the shadows, the paper trail of scandal. In the world of the 19th century elite, ink was more dangerous than gunpowder. A single sheet of parchment, heavy with the scent of lavender or the salt of a tear, held the power to topple empires and turn dukes into beggars. For Lady Isabella Vance, her secret correspondence with Lucian had become her lifeline and her noose. The dangerous art of secret correspondence. Every letter was a gamble. Isabella sat at her mahogany writing desk, the scratching of her quill the only sound in the silent room. Writing to Lucian was an act of treason, not against the crown, but against the bloodline. To write a secret, Isabella whispered to the flickering candle, is to give your enemy a knife and hope they never use it. To ensure the letters reached their destination, she had to master the art of the shadow. She didn't use the family's crest or the house messengers. Instead, she used a network of sympathetic laundresses and street urchins who understood the value of a silver shilling and a closed mouth. The paper was thin, onion skin, so it could be swallowed or burned in a heartbeat. The ink was specially formulated to fade if exposed to direct sunlight for too long. But even with these precautions, the paper trail was a physical manifestation of her sin. The anatomy of a scandalous letter. What did she write? She wrote the things the gilded cage wouldn't allow her to say. She wrote of the nights she spent staring at the stars, wondering if freedom was worth the fire. She wrote of Lucian's eyes, which saw through her porcelain mask. My dearest shadow, she wrote, her hand trembling, the walls of Oakhaven are closing in. My father speaks of my betrothal to the Earl as if I am a piece of livestock to be traded for land. The only time I feel the blood in my veins is when I read your words. Tell me again of the world where names do not matter. But the danger wasn't just in the words. It was in the artifacts. A misplaced silk ribbon used to tie the bundle, a smudge of wax from a candle that wasn't authorized for her room, a stained envelope that carried the mud of the London docks. These were the breadcrumbs that the vultures of the Tun lived to find. The incident of the misplaced ribbon. The first crack in her security happened on a Tuesday. Martha, the new maid, sharp-eyed and suspiciously quiet, was tidying the dressing room. Isabella had hidden the latest letter inside the lining of a winter coat. As Martha shook out the garment, a small, emerald-green ribbon fell to the floor. It was not a ribbon from the Vance collection. It was common silk, the kind sold in the markets of the East End. "Is this yours, my lady?" Martha asked, her voice neutral, but her eyes lingering a second too long on the silk. Isabella felt the blood drain from her face. It must have been from the seamstress. Throw it away, Martha. It was a small mistake, a tiny oversight, but in the House of Vance, small mistakes were the seeds of grand tragedies. A dynasty in peril. A week later, the Duke summoned Isabella to his study. The room smelled of old paper and ancient authority. On his desk lay a stained envelope. It was crumpled, smelling faintly of the Thames and cheap tobacco. Isabella's breath hitched. She recognized the handwriting. Lucian's script was bold, jagged, and unapologetic. "Explain this," the Duke said. His voice was not loud. It was the sound of a blade being sharpened. I don't know what that is, father," she lied, her voice a fragile glass. "Do not insult me, Ilara or Isabella, whoever you are becoming," he snapped. "This was found by the carriage driver near the gates. It is addressed to the Raven. A pseudonym, how romantic, how deadly." He picked up the letter with 2 fingers, as if it were a diseased animal. "Do you realize what this is? This is the end of 300 years of dignity. If the Earl's family sees this, the marriage is cancelled. The Vance fortune is frozen. We will be the mockery of every parlor in Europe." The psychology of blackmail. The Duke didn't burn the letter. That was the most terrifying part. He kept it. He understood that a letter was more than evidence. It was a tool of control. "The paper trail ends here," he said, locking the envelope in his heavy iron safe. "You will not leave this house. You will not write another word. You will marry the Earl in 1 month, or I will ensure that your shadow is found and hanged for kidnapping." Isabella realized then that the nobility didn't care about the truth, they cared about the trail. If the trail was hidden, the sin didn't exist. But now, her father owned her soul because he owned her ink. The secret network breaks. The letters from the shadows began to turn into letters of despair. Isabella managed to smuggle one last message to the laundress. "The trail is found. My father holds the knife. Do not come for me. The cage is now made of iron." But the laundress was gone. The Duke's men had cleared the estate of anyone who smelled of the outside. The secret network was dismantled. The silence that followed was louder than any scream. The stained reputation. In the parlors of London, the whispers began. They didn't have the letters, but they had the smell of the scandal. "She looks pale," Lady Danbury would whisper. "Have you heard? The Duke has locked his study doors, something about a correspondence." A stained envelope doesn't just ruin the person who wrote it, it stains the entire house. The servants began to gossip. The younger sisters began to cry in the hallways. The gilded cage was becoming a house of ghosts.